Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping back into a world where the air tastes of dry earth and wood smoke, a place where the horizon isn't blocked by skyscrapers but by the shimmering heat of the West African savanna. You are standing in the middle of a clearing, the red dust of the Zazzau plains settling into the creases of your skin, and if you listen closely, you can hear the rhythmic thumping of grain being pestled in a nearby village. The year is somewhere in the mid-1500s, and the sun is a heavy golden weight on your shoulders. You're not just a traveler here, you read a witness to the rise of a girl who would eventually make the very ground shake. Before you stands a young Amina, not yet a queen, but already carrying herself with a stillness that suggests she knows something the rest of the world has figured out yet. She's watching a group of traders pass by, her eyes tracking the movement of their horses with a clinical, almost predatory focus. Let us be honest for a second. You probably wouldn't survive this era for more than 24 hours. Between the tsetse flies, the size of small birds, and the fact that you'd likely offend a local warlord just by standing the wrong way, your modern sensibilities are a liability here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're listening from tonight. So go ahead and post your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the grit of the Sahel beneath your sandals as you walk toward the city of Turunku. This isn't the Zaria you might know from a modern map. This is the ancestral heart of the Zazzau people. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and the pungent, earthy scent of indigo dye vats. As you move through the winding corridors of the settlement, you notice that everything is built for defense. The walls are thick, made of sun-baked mud, and reinforced with the thorns of the acacia tree. It's a mainstream historical fact that Zazzau, one of the original 7 Hausa states, was the southernmost kingdom, often serving as the slayer of men, or the primary source of labor and protection for its northern siblings like Kano and Kachina. But as you watch a young Amina sit at the feet of her mother, Queen Turunku, you realize this isn't just a kingdom of warriors, it's a kingdom of planners. Amina isn't playing with dolls or learning the delicate art of courtly gossip. Instead, you see her leaning over a map etched into the dirt, her fingers tracing the trade routes that connect the forest regions of the south to the salt mines of the north. There is a quirky fringe tidbit, often whispered in the oral traditions of the region, that as a child, Amina refused to wear the softer fabrics imported from the east, preferring the heavy coarse-weave indigo cloth of her own people, because it did untear when she practiced with a wooden sword. You can see the calluses on her palms even now. Watching the blacksmith the Makaran, she is looking at the jewelry they're remaking for her mother's court. She's looking at the way the iron glows, the way it flows when the heat is just right, and how it hardens into something that can pierce through the toughest hide. There is a quiet tension in the air. The Hausa states are wealthy, yes, but they are fractured. To the south, the Quadarafa Empire is a constant, looming shadow, a predatory force that treats the Hausa plains like a grocery store. To the west, the Songhai Empire is a crumbling titan, still powerful enough to crush a small city-state but losing its grip on the trade routes. You watch Amina watch the world, and you see the gears turning. Historians still argue whether Amina was a literal daughter of Turunku, or perhaps a metaphorical successor title passed to a woman of exceptional military merit. But in this moment, looking at her, it doesn't matter. You see the spark. You see the beginning of a shift from a culture that merely defended its walls to one that would eventually expand them until they encompassed the horizon. The market in Turunku is a sensory overload. You walk past piles of kola nuts, their bitter scent cutting through the humid air, and bags of salt that are literally worth their weight in gold. Amina isn't looking at the goods though, she's looking at the taxes. She sees the tribute being paid in cowrie shells and livestock. She understands, even at this age, that wealth is the fuel for the fire she wants to build. You see her walk over to a group of cavalrymen, her brother Karami among them. They laugh, perhaps a bit patronizingly, as she asks about the weight of their lances. They don't realize that she isn't just curious, she's calculating. She's wondering how much force it takes to break a formation, and, more importantly, how much it costs to equip 1,000 men to do it. As night begins to fall over the Zazzau plains, the temperature drops rapidly. You wrap your arms around yourself, feeling the sudden chill of the desert air. The fires in the city start to flicker to life, casting long dancing shadows against the red walls. Amina remains outside, staring at the stars, or perhaps at the silhouettes of the distant hills. You get the sense that she's already living in a future that no one else can see yet. A future where the sound of the market isn't just the haggling of merchants, but the roar of something much louder. Something that would turn the very wealth of the marketplace into the iron teeth of an empire. You find a place to rest near the palace gates, the sound of a distant kontigi lute lulling the city to sleep. But Amina is still awake. She's talking to an old master smith, someone who remembers the secrets of the furnace from before the Great Migrations. You can't hear their words, but you see the way the old man nods, his eyes widening in a mixture of fear and respect. The foundation is being laid. The taxes of the future aren't going to be spent on gold jewelry or finer silks. They're going to be melted down. They're going to be forged. And as you drift off to sleep in this ancient world, you realize that the history books might have missed the most important part of her story. That she did unjust inherit power, she engineered it from the ground up, shell by shell and spark by spark. The Queen of Zazzau is coming, and she's bringing the thunder with her. The morning light in 16th century Zazzau doesn't just wake you up. It arrives with a sudden golden clarity that reveals the sheer scale of the world you've dropped into. You're standing at the edge of the Kasuwar Kurmi, one of the legendary markets that acted as the beating heart of the Hausa states. The air is a thick, swirling cocktail of smells, the sweetness of overripe dates, the sharp temps of curing leather, and the earthy muscovy scent of camels that have just completed a 40-day trek across the Sahara. You watch as the merchants begin to unroll their mats, their movements rhythmic and practiced, a dance of commerce that has remained unchanged for centuries. Amina is here too, but she ice and tea draped in the heavy gold or fine Egyptian linens you might expect of a royal. Instead, she moves through the crowd like a shadow, her presence felt more than seen, observing the flow of currency with the focus of a hawk circling a field. You notice something peculiar as you follow her through the stalls. Money here isn't just gold coins or silver bars. It's alive in the form of the cowrie shell. It's a mainstream historical fact that these small, glossy shells sourced primarily from the Maldives in the Indian Ocean connected the savannah to global trade networks. You see a merchant exchange a handful of shells for a woven basket of grain. The clinking sound they make like porcelain wind chimes. It's a delicate, beautiful system, but to your modern eyes, it seems almost fragile. How do you build an army with seashells? Amina seems to be asking the same thing. She picks up a single shell, turning it over in her hand, her expression unreadable. You can almost see her calculating the exchange rate of peace versus the cost of iron. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that local storytellers sometimes mention when they feeling particularly bold. It's said that Amina once spent an entire week disguised as a common trader's assistant just to see which merchants were skimming off the top of the royal levies. Imagine you, with your modern customer service attitude, trying to survive a week of heavy lifting and intense haggling in the Sahel heat. You'd probably be fired within the first hour for complaining about the lack of an iced latte. But Amina, she was absorbing the mechanics of the market. She was learning that power isn't just about who has the biggest sword, but who controls the points of exchange. She watched how the taxman of the Eru, the officials appointed by her mother, collected the tolls at the city gates. She saw the wealth of the world flowing in, salt from the north, gold from the Akan fields to the south, and the terrifyingly expensive horses from North Africa. The market isn't just a place for buying and selling. It's the kingdom's social internet. Information travels faster here than a desert wind. You overhear a group of Tuareg traders discussing the political instability in the Songhai capital of Ghana. They speak in hushed tones about fire sticks seen on the coast, weapons that make a sound like the gods screaming. Historians still argue whether these early mentions of gunpowder weapons reached the Hausa heartland through the trans-Saharan routes or the maritime trade with the Portuguese, but the debate remains a staple of academic circles to this day. You see Amina pause when she hears them. She doesn't join the conversation, but her grip tightens on the shell in her hand. She knows that Zazzau is currently a middleman state-rich, yes, but vulnerable to anyone with a faster horse or a louder weapon. As you walk deeper into the market with her, the noise becomes a literal wall of sound. There's the clanging of the coppersmiths, the shouting of the livestock dealers, and the melodic calls of the water sellers. Amina stops at a stall selling imported sulfur and charcoal items used for medicine and leather curing, but also the fundamental ingredients of something far more volatile. She isn't looking at them for their medicinal properties, she's looking at the volume. She asks the merchant where the sulfur comes from, her voice low and steady. The merchant, not recognizing the princess in her simple attire, laughs and tells her it comes from the belly of the earth, far beyond the Great Sea. You see a flicker of frustration in her eyes. The ingredients for the future are scattered across the globe, and she needs to figure out how to pull them all into her orbit. You notice a shift in the atmosphere as a group of royal guards marches through the square, clearing a path for a high-ranking official. The commoners bow, but Amina simply steps back into the shade of a baobab tree, her eyes never leaving the guards' equipment. Their spears are good, their shields are sturdy, but they are traditional. They are built for the wars of yesterday. You realize that while everyone else is focused on the price of grain or the beauty of a new silk wrap, Amina is looking at the market as a giant furnace. She's wondering how many cowrie shells it takes to buy the loyalty of a master smith, and how much salt she has to tax to pay for a foundry that can melt more than just jewelry. The sun is at its zenith now, and the heat is starting to make the air shimmer and dance. You're probably feeling a bit lightheaded. Don't worry, that's just the 16th century dehydration kicking in. Amina, however, seems fueled by the heat. She leads you toward the edge of the market, where the heavier trade happens. This is where the iron ingots are stacked, crude, and blackened. She walks up to a pile and kicks one, listening to the dull thud it makes against the earth. To anyone else, it's just raw material. To her, it's the skeletal remains of the empire she hasn't built yet. She turns to a scribe who has been trailing her at a distance and whispers a command. You can't hear it, but the scribe's eyes widen as he begins to jot down figures on a piece of parchment. As the afternoon begins to mellow, the market doesn't slow down. It just changes its rhythm. The heavy lifting is done, and now the storytelling begins. You sit near a fire as a griot begins to sing the history of the Hausa people, his voice rising and falling with the crackle of the flames. He sings of the legendary hero Bayajida and the slaying of the snake in the well at Dora. It's a story of liberation through the blade. But as you look at Amina, sitting silently in the shadows, you realize she's planning a different kind of liberation. She isn't interested in the legends of the past. She's interested in the physics of the future. She knows that the shell currency, for all its beauty, is just a tool, and tools can be redesigned. Before you leave the market for the day, Amina does something strange. She takes a handful of cowrie shells and drops them into a small crucible used by a nearby smith. She watches as the heat of the forge begins to blacken the white surfaces. It's a symbolic gesture, perhaps a private vow. She's going to turn this wealth into something that can't be spent, only feared. You follow her back toward the palace, the sound of the market fading behind you, replaced by the rhythmic clanking of the city's defense works being repaired. The transition has already begun in her mind. The market isn't just for trade anymore. It's the treasury of a revolution. The air inside the smelting district of Turunku is a different beast entirely from the breezy marketplace. Here, the atmosphere is thick with the metallic temps of oxidized iron and the suffocating heat of the bahu, the traditional Hausa towel shaft furnaces. You're standing in what looks like a forest of clay towers, each one belching a thin, steady stream of charcoal smoke into the hazy sky. You can feel the sweat stinging your eyes, and your lungs are already protesting the soot. If you think your local gym's sauna is intense, you wouldn't last 5 minutes here without a modern cooling towel and a gallon of electrolytes. Amina, however, seems to breathe this air like it's mountain mist. She's standing near a group of men who are stripped to the waist, their muscles glistening as they work the goatskin bellows in a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse. You are witnessing the heart of the Hausa metallurgical tradition, a craft so sophisticated that it was the envy of the entire region. It's a mainstream historical fact that West African iron smelting techniques were independently developed and highly advanced, often achieving temperatures that rivaled European furnaces of the same era. The blacksmiths, or makera, were not just craftsmen. They were a distinct social class, often viewed with a mix of reverence and a hint of spiritual dread. You watch as they pull a glowing bloom of iron from the base of a furnace. It's raw, ugly, and incredibly powerful. Amina reaches out, her hand hovering just inches from the radiating heat, her eyes fixed on the liquid slag as it's bled away from the pure metal. She isn't here to commission a new set of bangles, she's studying the viscosity of the molten iron. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that crops up in certain local legends that Amina used to bring the blacksmith's rare ores, she found during her rides across the rocky outcrops of the Zaria region, challenging them to tell her why some stones melted into brittle shards, while others became flexible blades. She was conducting informal materials science, while the rest of the world was worrying about the price of grain. You see her pick up a discarded spearhead that has cooled to a dull gray. She taps it against a stone, listening to the ring of the metal. She's looking for a specific sound, the clear, high-pitched note of high-carbon steel. She knows that if she's going to build something that can contain an explosion, the metal cannot have any hidden pockets of air or cold shuts that would cause it to shatter. As you follow her deeper into the forge, the noise is deafening. The rhythmic clink-clink of hammers on anvils creates a chaotic symphony. Historians still argue whether the Hausa smiths of this period were already experimenting with casting hollow forms, or if their expertise was strictly limited to forging and welding. Some scholars suggest that the technology for casting heavy bronze or iron tubes might have been a closely guarded secret of specific families, passed down through oral incantations disguised as songs. You watch as a master smith begins to shape a ceremonial vessel, pouring molten copper into a clay mold. Amina watches the process with a terrifying intensity. You can see the logic clicking into place in her mind. If you can cast a pot to hold water, you can cast a cylinder to hold fire. The forge is also a place of ritual. You see the smith sprinkle a bit of traditional medicine over the cooling metal, a practice meant to calm the spirit of the iron. Amina doesn't mock these traditions. She understands that morale is just as important as metallurgy. But she's also practical. She pulls the master smith aside, a man whose beard is singed white at the edges, and begins to draw in the soot on the floor. You lean in to see what she's sketching. It's a long, tapered shaper tube with a reinforced breech. The smith looks at the drawing, then back at the princess, his face a mask of confusion. He knows how to make a sword, a hoe, a spear. He even knows how to make the intricate iron gates for the palace. But this is something different. This is a weapon that doesn't rely on the strength of a man's arm, but on the strength of the metal itself. You notice that the other smiths have stopped their work to watch. There's a palpable sense of shift in the room. This isn't just a royal visit, it's a recruitment drive. Amina is looking for the masters of fire, who are willing to break tradition. She's offering them more than just cowrie shells. She's offering them a place in a new kind of history. You see one young apprentice, his face smeared with charcoal, looking at Amina's sketch with a spark of recognition. He's the one who will eventually help her figure out the cooling process that prevents the metal from cracking. Under the immense pressure of a gunpowder discharge, it's a dangerous game. If the barrel isn't cast perfectly, it becomes a pipe bomb that kills the operator instead of the enemy. The heat in the smelting district is starting to become truly oppressive. You find yourself leaning against a mud wall, trying to find a patch of air that isn't shimmering. Amina, seemingly unaffected, continues to gesture toward the bellows. She wants more heat. She wants to see how far the metal can be pushed before it loses its integrity. It's a brutal, repetitive process of trial and error. You watch as a test casting, a small, thick-walled pipe is pulled from the sand. It's rough and pitted, but as Amina runs her fingers over the surface, you see a rare smile touch her lips. It's a start. It's a prototype. Before you leave the smoke of the forges, Amina takes a piece of charcoal and marks the forehead of the master smith. It's a sign of her protection, but also a mark of her ownership. These men are no longer just artisans for the city. They are the private engineers of the Zazzau military machine. As you walk out into the cooling evening air, the orange glow of the furnaces reflecting in the darkening sky, you realize that the transformation of the kingdom has moved from the ledger books of the market to the fires of the foundry. The thunder isn't just a metaphor anymore. It's being forged, pound by pound, in the heart of the city. And the secrets of the smoke are about to change the face of the savannah forever. The golden hour of the savannah casts long, spindly shadows across the palace courtyard. But the beauty of the sunset doesn't mask the tension thick enough to choke on. You are standing in the center of the Hausa Bakwitha legendary seven-state sand. The political landscape is as jagged as the rocky outcrops surrounding Zazzau, your current home, sits at the bottom of this heptagon of power, acting as the gateway to the southern forests. It's a mainstream historical fact that while these states shared a common language and culture, they were rarely a unified front. They were siblings who spent as much time squabbling over trade routes as they did defending against outsiders. You see the messengers arriving on lathered horses, their faces grim, carrying news of unrest from the northern borders of Kano and the western reaches of Kachina. Maintaining a fragile peace in the 1500s wasn't about signing treaties with fancy fountain pens. It was about the delicate balance of grain, gold, and blood. You're watching Amina navigate a meeting of the local clan heads. And let's be real, modern conflict resolution workshops would be laughed out of the room here. One wrong word, and you aren't looking at a HR complaint, you're looking at a spear through the chest. Amina, however, moves through the seated elders with the grace of a leopard in tall grass. She isn't arguing with them, she's listening to their fears. They are worried about the Quarafa to the south, a warlike confederation that has been eyeing the wealth of the Hausa plains like a lion eyes a tethered goat. The peace isn't just fragile, it's practically transparent. There is a quirky fringe tidbit, often whispered by those who study the esoteric side of Hausa history, that the peace was held together not just by diplomacy, but by a complex system of joking relationships or sharo, where different clans were culturally mandated to diffuse tension through ritualized mockery. Imagine trying to stop a war by making fun of your opponent as Hatit as a bold strategy, and honestly, we could probably use more of it today. But as you watch Amina, you see she isn't interested in joking. She's looking at the strategic maps of the region. She knows that Zazzau's position makes it the buffer state. If the south rises, Zazzau falls first. If the north turns greedy, Zazzau is the first to be squeezed. The threat isn't just military, it's existential. Historians still argue whether the Hausa states of this period were truly independent entities, or if they functioned more like a loose confederacy with a shifting hegemon or led city. In this moment, Zazzau is far from the top of the food chain. You see the elder counselors glancing at Amina with a mixture of skepticism and traditionalist disdain. To them, she is a princess whose primary role should be to secure a strategic marriage alliance perhaps. To a prince in Gobir or a merchant king in Dora, they see her interest in the military as a youthful whim, a phase she'd grow out of once the responsibilities of the throne settle on her shoulders. You can almost feel her silent fury at their narrow vision. You follow her out onto the ramparts of the city walls as the first stars begin to prick through the violet sky. From here you can see the campfires of a dozen merchant caravans camped outside the gates. This is the source of the fragile peace. As long as the goods flow the salt from the north, the slaves in gold from the south, everyone is too busy getting rich to start a full-scale war. But Amina knows that wealth without a wall is just an invitation for a robbery. She points toward the southern horizon, where the darkness seems deeper. The Quarafa are out there. They don't care about the delicate balance of the Hausa Bakwai, they only care about the harvest as you stand there in the cooling wind. You realize that the politics of the region are a giant game of musical chairs, and the music is about to stop. Amina begins to speak, her voice low, so only you, and perhaps the ghosts of the ancestors, can hear. She talks about the 7 sisters of the Hausa states, and how they are like a hand with fingers that refuse to make a fist. She isn't just planning to defend Zazzau, she's planning to redefine what Zazzau is. She sees the other 6 states not as rivals to be defeated, but as pieces of a larger puzzle that only she has the courage to assemble. The social hierarchy here is rigid. You see the Sark and the king being carried in a litter below, surrounded by drummers and praisingers. The pomp and circumstance are meant to project power, but to Amina, it's just noise. She's looking at the equipment of the guardsmen again. Their padded cotton armor is good against arrows, but it won't stop a heavy cavalry charge from the southern raiders. She realizes that the only way to protect the peace is to become so formidable that war becomes an unthinkable option for her neighbors. It's the classic peace through superior firepower doctrine. Centuries before, it had a name. You notice a group of foreign dignitaries from the Songhai Empire leaving the palace. They look polished, slightly arrogant, and entirely unaware that the woman watching them from the wall is about to render their traditional dominance obsolete. They think they are the masters of the savannah because they control the river trade. Amina knows that the land is where the true power lies. She turns away from the view and starts descending the stone steps, her pace brisk. She's done with the talk of the council. The fragile peace has served its purpose. It has given her the time she needed to observe. Now, she needs to act. Before the night fully claims the plains, you see her stop at a small shrine dedicated to the spirit of the earth. she doesn't pray for peace. She prays for the strength of the iron she saw in the forges earlier that day. You get the sense that the fragile part of the story is about to shatter, and when it does, Amina will be the one holding the pieces. You're not just watching the history of a city, you're watching the birth of an empire that will eventually swallow its siblings to survive. The savannah is quiet for now, but the air feels charged, like the moments before a massive summer thunderstorm breaks over the Zaria hills. The council chamber of Zazzau is a place of heavy shadows and even heavier traditions. You are standing along the perimeter of a room where the air is stagnant, smelling of old parchment, expensive incense, and the collective breath of 50 men who believe they hold the world in their hands. The walls are adorned with the shields of fallen heroes, and the floor is covered in thick, hand-woven carpets from the north. In the center sits the Sarkin, flanked by his advisors, the Galadima, the Matawaki, and the Waziri. You can feel the weight of their gaze as Amina enters. She doesn't wait to be acknowledged. She walks to the center of the room, her presence cutting through the murmurs of the court like a cold wind. This is the moment where the princess becomes a strategist, and the men in the room don't quite know how to handle the shift in the air. You see the Matawaki, the commander of the cavalry, shift uncomfortably in his seat. It's a mainstream historical fact that in the Hausa kingdoms, military leadership was almost exclusively a male domain. Rooted in the prowess of the heavy cavalry and the ability to lead lightning-fast raids, Amina is standing there, not with a tray of refreshments or a list of household concerns, but with a piece of charcoal and a plan. You watch as she interrupts a debate about the price of horse fodder to point out a flaw in the city's southern gate defenses. The silence that follows is deafening. If you were to try this in a modern corporate boardroom, just walking in and telling the CEO his entire infrastructure is a ticking time bomb, you'd be escorted out by security before you could say disruptive innovation. But here, the stakes aren't a job. They're the survival of a lineage. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit hidden in the oral histories of the Zaria court that, during these early council meetings, Amina would bring a small, sharpened dagger and use it to pick her teeth while the elders spoke, a silent, slightly terrifying display of, "I am not afraid of your protocols." It's the 16th century equivalent of a power move. You see the younger officers leaning in, intrigued by her audacity, while the older men grow red-faced. Amina isn't just offering opinions. She's casting a shadow over the entire council. She begins to talk about the wall, but not just any wall. She is talking about an integrated system of defense that connects the marketplace directly to the military barracks. She is proposing that the taxes collected from the salt trade be redirected from the royal treasury into a specialized unit of engineers. The debate turns heated. Historians still argue whether Amina's influence at this stage was due to her mother's backing, or if she had already secured the personal loyalty of the Ironsmith clans through her visits to the forges. You watch as she stands her ground against the Galadima, the chief administrator. He argues that the merchants will revolt if their taxes are raised for invisible defenses. Amina counters by reminding him that a merchant without a city is just a target. She speaks with a cadence that is calm yet relentless, a rhythmic delivery that mimics the steady beat of a war drum. You can see the shift in the room. The shadow she is casting is just a lack of light the silhouette of a new kind of power. You notice the Sarkin watching his daughter with a mixture of pride and profound unease. He sees the way the guards at the door look at her not as a royal to be protected, but as a leader to be followed. Amina pulls out a small leather pouch and pours a handful of the sulfur and charcoal you saw in the market onto a stone table. She doesn't explain what it is, she just lets it sit there. A dark, gritty pile that looks like nothing but acts as a promise of what's to come. She tells the council that the wars of the future will not be won by the man with the longest spear, but by the state that can command the elements themselves. The council begins to fracture. Some of the elders mutter about forbidden arts and the spirits of the smoke, but the younger commanders are looking at the powder with a hungry curiosity. You realize that Amina is intentionally creating a generational divide. She is building a new guard within the old palace walls. She's offering the young men glory through technology rather than just through heredity. It's a masterclass in psychological warfare played out in a room full of people who think they just discussing a budget. You're rewatching the very fabric of Zaria's social order being pulled apart and rewoven right in front of you. As the meeting draws to a close, Amina doesn't ask for permission to leave. She simply turns and walks out, leaving the charcoal powder on the table. You follow her, and as you pass the guards, you see them straighten their posture, their eyes following her with a reverence that borders on the religious. The shadow she left in that room is permanent. The council will spend the rest of the night arguing, but the momentum has already shifted. Amina has successfully moved the conversation from if we should change to how fast we can do it. The evening air outside the council chamber is sweet and cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the debate. You walk with her toward the barracks, and you realize she's already moving on to the next phase. The council was just a formality, a hurdle to be cleared. The real work is in the training yards and the foundry. She turns to you, her expression illuminated by the torches lining the palace walk, and you see a flicker of gentle sarcasm in her eyes. It's as if she's saying, "Did you see how long it took them to realize the world changed while they were talking?" You realize that Amina's greatest weapon isn't the cannon she's trying to build. It's her ability to see the cracks in the status quo. She has spent her life watching the market, the forges, and the trade routes. And now she's bringing all those threads together to strangle the old way of doing things. As you reach the barracks, the sound of metal clashing against metal tells you that the training never stops. The shadow over the council was just the eclipse before the storm. Tomorrow, the taxes will be collected, and for the first time in Zazzau's history, the shells won't be going into the vault, they'll be going into the fire. The sun hasn't even cleared the horizon yet, but the gates of Zaria are already groaning open, their massive timber frames yielding to the push of a dozen guards. You are standing in the pre-dawn blue, that strange, hushed moment where the world feels like it's held its breath. As the first light hits the red clay walls, you see them, the caravans. They stretch back into the morning mist like a giant, segmented serpent. You see hundreds of camels, their humps sagging with the weight of salt slabs from Todeni, and donkeys laden with kola nuts wrapped in damp leaves to keep them fresh. This is the economics of the caravan, and in the 16th century, this was the equivalent of a global fiber-optic cablelet moved wealth. News and power across thousands of miles of inhospitable sand. It's a mainstream historical fact that the trans-Saharan trade was the lifeblood of the Hausa states, making cities like Zaria indispensable hubs where the products of the Mediterranean met the treasures of the tropical rainforests. You watch as the lead merchant, a man draped in indigo robes that have stained his skin a ghostly blue, pays the entry toll. He doesn't hand over a credit card. He counts out thousands of cowrie shells. You might think counting shells is tedious, but try doing it while a grumpy camel is trying to chew on your hair. You'd probably give up and just hand over your wallet. Amina is standing on the gatehouse above, her eyes not on the goods, but on the volume. She is literally counting the pulse of her kingdom. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding these caravans. Legend says that Amina scouts would often accidentally break a small portion of a merchant's crate just to verify the contents weren't being misreported for tax purposes. It was a 1500s version of a random customs audit, usually followed by a very polite, very terrifying apology from a royal guard. You see her nodding as the tallymen record the weights. She isn't just looking for gold, she's looking for the raw materials of war. Lead for musket balls, refined copper from the Byzantine markets, and saltpeter, that crumbly white substance that smells of ammonia and tastes like the end of an era. Historians still argue whether the Hausa states actually produced their own saltpeter or if they were entirely dependent on the white gold brought down by the Tuareg nomads. Some scholars suggest that Amina's engineers developed a way to harvest it from the Nightsageneric, soil beneath the city's massive livestock pens, a feat of early chemical engineering that would have made Zazzau self-sufficient in gunpowder production. You watch as a group of scholars from the Sankor Madrasa in Timbuktu pass through the gates, their mules carrying scrolls instead of spices. Amina stops them. She doesn't want to talk about theology or law today. She wants to know about the naphtha used in the northern sieges. She is treating the caravan as a library of tactical secrets. The market inside the walls is a boiling pot of languages: Hausa, Arabic, Tuareg, and even fragments of Portuguese. You follow Amina as she weaves through the chaos. She stops at a stall selling silk from the east. She feels the fabric, but she's looking at the person selling it. She asks about the route from the coast, how many days, which rivers are high. She is building a mental map of the world's logistical vulnerabilities. You realize that while the merchants see a path to profit, Amina sees a path for her armies. Every caravan that enters the city is a stress test for the roads she plans to pave with her own authority. You notice a particular group of traders from the Oyo Empire to the south. They are selling ivory and pepper, but they look nervous. They've heard the rumors that the Girl King of Zazzau is buying up every scrap of scrap metal in the city. They try to hike their prices. But Amina's tax collectors are already there with a new set of market stabilization decrees. You have to admire the sheer audacity of it. She's using the very wealth these merchants bring in to fund a military machine that will eventually dictate the terms of their trade. It's like a tech startup using its first round of funding to build a wall around its competitors. The heat of the day is starting to rise, and the smell of the caravan, a mix of animal musk, spices, and sweat, becomes overwhelming. You see a young boy leading a string of horses, their coats glistening like polished mahogany. These are the Barbs and Arabians, the Ferraris of the 16th century. Amina walks up to the finest stallion and checks its teeth, then its hooves. She knows that for all her talk of thundersticks, the horse is still the king of the savannah. She needs a way to merge the speed of the cavalry with the power of the cannon. You see her whisper something to her head of stables, and the man begins to mark the best horses for the royal special project. As the caravan settles into the cities, many caravanserais, the ancient version of a motel. The city feels bloated with wealth, but Amina knows that wealth is heavy and slow. She looks at the heaps of grain and the stacks of salt and sees only potential energy. She turns to you, a slight smirk playing on her lips, as she watches a merchant struggle to secure a massive chest of shells. She's thinking that a single cannon, cast from the copper in those chests, is worth more than 1,000 chests sitting in a vault. You follow her away from the noise toward the quieter, industrial sector of the city. Behind the vibrant colors of the silks and the aromatic smoke of the spice stalls, the real work is happening. The taxis from this morning's caravan are already being diverted. You see the shell runners carrying heavy baskets of currency toward the foundry district. The economics of the caravan are being cannibalized to feed the fires of the future. Amina has realized the ultimate truth of the empire builder. You don't need to own the gold, you just need to own the gate. And once she has her cannons, she won't just own the gate to Zaryeshi, own the gate to the entire Sahara. The crown of Zazzau doesn't feel like a golden halo. It feels like a heavy, cold band of iron pressing against your temples. You are standing in the great hall, and the air is thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood from the ritual sacrifices that marked the transition of power. Your brother Kurami is gone dead after a short, tumultuous reign, and now the mantle has fallen to Amina. You look at her as she sits on the carved mahogany throne, and she doesn't look relieved. She looks like a builder who has finally been given the keys to a crumbling house. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina took the throne of Zazzau around 1576, inheriting a kingdom that was financially prosperous thanks to its market taxes, but militarily stagnant compared to the rising empires on its borders. You are now the sovereign of a city of walls, but as you look out from the palace heights, you realize those walls are a cage as much as a shield. The people are cheering in the streets, throwing petals and shells, but the you probably wouldn't. To survive this reality is that a female ruler in the 16th century Sahel is a target for every ambitious general and disgruntled cousin in the region. You'd probably be looking for the nearest exit or a very strong tea, but Amina is looking at the architecture. She isn't interested in the coronation feast. She's interested in the integrity of the mud brick ramparts. She knows that a kingdom of walls is only as strong as the will to expand them. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests Amina's first act as queen wasn't to appoint a cabinet, but to personally inspect the thickness of the city's outer gates with a measuring rod. Imagine the confusion of the palace guards as their new queen ignores the ceremonial honey cakes to poke at the mortar with a stick. She was checking for rot, both physical and political. You see her run her hand over the rough surface of the inner wall, her eyes narrowed. These walls were built to stop men with ladders and bows. They weren't built for what she has planned. They weren't built to be a platform for the thunder she saw in the forges. Historians still argue whether Amina's immediate focus on military expansion was a choice or a necessity forced by a coup attempt early in her reign. Some suggest that her inheritance was actually contested by the traditionalist military elite, and her only way to survive was to lead them on a campaign so successful they could afford to depose her. You watch as she calls for the Matawaki, the head of the cavalry. He approaches with a bow that is just a little too shallow, a little too slow. He thinks he's going to be the power behind the throne. Amina doesn't even look at him. She points to a map of the surrounding territories. She doesn't ask if the army is ready. She tells him where they will be by the next moon. The palace itself is a maze of courtyards and hidden corridors. You follow Amina as she moves through the living quarters, stripping away the ornate silks of a princess for the practical, layered cotton of a commander. She is shedding the inheritance of a daughter and assuming the role of a state builder. You notice that she keeps a small blackened piece of iron from the first test casting in Section 3 on a leather cord around her neck. It's a reminder that she isn't just a queen of people, she's a queen of materials. The wealth of Zazzau, cowries, the salt, the indigo is now her raw material. She is going to melt down the tradition of the kingdom to cast a new reality. You see the anxiety in the eyes of the court officials. They inherited a world of stable trade and predictable skirmishes. They like the walls are safe. But as Amina stands on the highest balcony, looking toward the southern forest belt, you realize she sees the walls as a limitation. She talks about Ganawar, Amina the walls of Aminan, as a way to hide. But as a way to mark the ever-growing footprint of her authority. She wants to build a kingdom that doesn't just sit on the trade route, but becomes the trade route. Every mile of road will be a mile of her territory. The transition is jarring. One day, the palace is a place of music and soft voices. The next, it is a command center. You watch as the inheritance is liquidated. The royal stables are reorganized for stamina over beauty. The royal granaries are audited to ensure they can support a long-distance march. Amina is turning the city of Zaria into a giant, stationary aircraft carrier of the 16th century. She's stripping the kingdom of its fat and replacing it with muscle. You find yourself caught in the whirlwind of her energy, helping to tally the armor and the spearheads. It's exhausting, and the heat of the central Nigerian sun is relentless, but there's a sense of purpose that wasn't there under her predecessors. As the first week of her reign ends, the city feels different. The merchants are still there, but they've noticed the change in the atmosphere. The Queen of Walls is no longer a nickname, it's a warning. Amina gathers her inner circle, the smiths and the young officers she recruited in the earlier sections, and shows them the treasury. It's full of shells, gold and ivory. She tells them that this is the last time they will see it sitting still. From now on, the wealth of Zazzau will be in motion. It will be the fuel for the furnaces and the pay for the men who will carry the cannons. You watch as she takes the ceremonial staff of office, and, instead of holding it like a scepter, she uses it to point toward the horizon. The inheritance of the 7 states is a gift, but to Amina, it's just the foundation. She's looking at the vast, unconquered spaces between the cities. She is looking at the rivals who think a woman on the throne is an opportunity for a land grab. You see her smile a cold, sharp thing as she realizes they have no idea what's coming. The Kingdom of Walls is about to start walking, and the dust it kicks up will be seen from the shores of the Niger to the banks of the Lake Chad. The transition from a princess' curiosity to a sovereign' mandate is written in the ink of new legislation. You are standing in the palace archives, watching a scribe's quill scratch frantically across vellum as Amina dictates the decree of the Iron Levy. The air here is cooler than the foundry, but the atmosphere is twice as heavy. You see, the problem with building a revolutionary military isn't just the physics, it's the financing. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's reign was characterized by a massive expansion of the Zazzau economy, specifically through a sophisticated system of tribute and trade taxes that funded her perpetual campaigns. But you're seeing the hidden version of this. She is unjust taxing the grain of the poor, she's targeting the luxury of the elite. You watch as the royal messengers are dispatched to the city gates with a new set of instructions. Every shipment of fine Egyptian linen, every jar of Mediterranean olives, and every bolt of Venetian silk is now subject to a defense surcharge. If you were a merchant trying to explain supply chain inflation to a 16th century queen, you'd probably find yourself in the stocks before you reached your second bullet point. Amina doesn't care about the profit margins of the middleman. She understands that the cowrie shell is a tool of energy, and she needs that energy redirected. She is effectively turning the kingdom's appetite for luxury into the propellant for her cannons. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests Amina's tax collectors began using a specific set of royal scales that were weighted slightly in favor of the crown. When the merchants complained, the collectors would simply point to the new, reinforced battlements and ask if the merchants would prefer to pay the tax or defend the city themselves the next time the Quararafa came knocking. It was the 1500s equivalent of a security fee on your phone bill, and it was just as non-negotiable. You see the piles of shells in the treasury growing, but they aren't staying there. They are being moved in massive baskets toward the outskirts of the city, toward the special projects zone. Historians still argue whether this aggressive taxation led to a secret rebellion among the merchant class, or if the increased security provided by Amina's army actually made them more profitable in the long run. Some scholars point to the Amina walls as a form of public works project that kept the economy circulating even during wartime. You watch as she reviews the ledgers. She isn't just looking at the total, she's looking at the source. She realizes that by taxing the trans-Saharan luxury goods, she is essentially getting the Songhai and the North Africans to pay for her weapons. It's a brilliant piece of geopolitical asymmetric financing that would make a modern economist's head spin. The defense levy isn't just about money, though it's about labor. You follow Amina as she visits the neighborhoods of the master builders. She isn't asking for volunteers, she is taxing the time of every able-bodied mason and smith in the city. For every 10 days they work for themselves, they must spend 3 days working on the Queen's foundries. You see the resentment in some of their eyes, but it's tempered by the fact that they are being fed from the royal granaries of luxury in a world where the next harvest is never guaranteed. Amina is creating a state-sponsored military-industrial complex centuries before the term existed. You notice that she has started to categorize the wealth of the kingdom into hard and soft assets. Gold and shells are soft, they can be traded, stolen, or devalued. Iron, sulfur, and saltpeter are hard. They are the true currency of power. She begins to offer tax breaks to any merchant who brings in high-quality copper or lead instead of currency. You see a trader from the coast arrive with a shipment of Manila's bronze bracelets used as currency by the Portuguese. And instead of putting them in the vault, Amina has them sent straight to the smelting pots. She is literally melting down the money of the world to cast the teeth of her empire. The city is vibrating with this new economic energy. It's no longer just a place of trade, it's a place of conversion. You walk past a group of weavers who are complaining that the price of indigo has gone up because the transport donkeys have been requisitioned for the army. Amina hears them, but doesn't stop. She knows that you can't make an omelet without breaking a few shells. She's focused on the long game. She knows that if she controls the military technology of the region, she won't just be taxing the trade, she'll be the one who owns the markets themselves. As the sun begins to set, casting a deep crimson glow over the stacks of shells in the courtyard, you see Amina pick up a single cowrie. She looks at its polished white surface, then tosses it into a nearby brazier. She watches as it turns black in the heat. To her, this isn't a loss of value, it's a transformation. The tax reform was the first true shot fired in her war for the savannah. She has successfully decoupled the kingdom's survival from the whims of the market and tied it to the heat of the forge. You follow her back into the palace, the sound of the scribe's quill still echoing in the hallway. The lists are getting longer. The levies are getting heavier. But as you look at the maps on the wall, you see that the Ganyuwar Amina are already starting to be sketched in a wider circle than before. The shells are being spent, the metal is being poured, and the defense levy is about to become the most successful investment in Zazzau's history. The kingdom is no longer just wealthy, it's becoming dangerous. The further you move away from the palace, the more the air begins to vibrate with a low, rhythmic thumping, the sound of 100 hammers striking iron in unison. You are traveling with Amina to the remote, rocky hills on the outskirts of the Zaria Plateau, a place where the wood smoke is so thick it clings to your clothes like a second skin. This is the domain of the Makra, the master blacksmiths, but not just any smiths. These are the masters of fire who live on the fringes of society, the ones who handle the most difficult ores and the most dangerous spiritual rites of the forge. You probably wouldn't survive a night in these camps. The heat is relentless, the mosquitoes are the size of small helicopters, and the social hierarchy is dictated entirely by how much heat your lungs can withstand. Amina isn't here to offer a royal greeting. She is here to find the men who can think in 3 dimensions: casting a cannon isn't like hammering out a sword. It requires an understanding of hollow mold casting and the way different metals contract as they cool. It's a mainstream historical fact that West African metallurgy was incredibly advanced, with the lost wax process being used to create intricate bronze works in Benin and Ife that rivaled anything produced in Europe during the Renaissance. Amina wants to take that artistic precision and turn it toward destruction. She stands before a master smith whose skin is so scarred by sparks it looks like a topographical map of the region. He doesn't bow. In this camp, the fire is the only king. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that Amina once challenged a master smith to a heat endurance contest, standing closer to the furnace than he could just to prove. She had the fire in her blood necessary to command their guild. Whether she won or simply survived, the legend served its purpose. The Smiths stopped seeing her as a royal and started seeing her as a patron of the flame. You watch as she unrolls a blueprint on a charred wooden table. It's not just a tube anymore. It's a weapon with trunnions, those small side protrusions that allow a cannon to be pivoted up and down. She is demanding a level of mechanical engineering that these men have only ever applied to the complex locks of the city gates. Historians still argue whether Amina's masters of fire were local, Hausa Smiths, or if she had recruited specialized bronzecasters from the neighboring Nupe or Benin territories. The debate centers on the specific alloy used. Some believe she pioneered a jungle bronze that used a higher concentration of local tin to make the barrels lighter for transport. You watch the master smith trace the lines of her drawing with a calloused thumb. He shakes his head, muttering about the spirit of the metal being too volatile for such a shape. Amina doesn't argue with his spirituality. She offers him a chest of the finest salt and a promise. Make me the tube that breathes fire, and your family will never pay a tax as long as my walls stand. The recruitment is a slow, methodical process. You follow her from forge to forge, watching her identify the innovators from the traditionalists. She's looking for the men who don't flinch when the molten metal splashes. She gathers them in a circle as the sun begins to dip behind the iron-rich hills, turning the sky the same angry orange as the furnaces. She tells them they are no longer just making hoes for the farmers or spears for the hunters. They are the architects of a new age. You can see the shift in their eyes, the spark of professional pride being fanned into an imperial flame. You notice a young smith, perhaps no older than 20, who is experimenting with a different kind of clay for the molds. He's mixing it with animal hair and fine sand to prevent cracking a technique you recognize as a precursor to modern refractory materials. Amina notices him too. She doesn't say a word, but she marks his furnace with a specific red pigment. He is now part of her inner foundry. You realize she is building a research and development department in the middle of a 16th century forest. It's an incredibly organized approach to what most would consider a chaotic craft. The logistics of this recruitment are staggering. These men need fuel tons of charcoal land. They need specialized ores that aren't always found in one place. Amina has already organized the charcoal caravans to feed these remote forges. You see the hills being stripped of specific hardwoods that burn at the highest temperatures. The masters of fire are hungry, and the kingdom's forests are the price of their genius. Amina watches a tree fall in the distance and doesn't blink. To her, every fallen tree is a potential barrel, every burned branch a step toward the thunder. As the night deepens, the hills are dotted with the glowing eyes of a dozen furnaces. It looks like a constellation fallen to earth. Amina sits by the central fire, sharing a meal of pounded yam and spicy stew with the smiths. She is breaking bread with the people who will actually build her empire. You see the respect they have for her, not because she's a queen, but because she understands the cost of the poor. She knows that if a mold fails, a man might lose his life to the fire spray. She is willing to take that risk alongside them. Before you leave the camp at dawn, the first experimental long tube is ready for its final cooling. It's a crude, blackened thing, still buried in the sand to temper the metal. Amina stands over it like a mother over a cradle. She isn't just looking at a weapon. She's looking at the physical manifestation of her tax reforms and her diplomacy. The Masters of Fire have delivered the first piece of the puzzle. As you ride back toward Zaria, the rhythmic thumping of the hammers follows you. A heartbeat that is now synchronized with the Queen's own ambition. The secret project is no longer a sketch in the suit. It has weight, it has heat, and soon it will have a voice. The air in the high-altitude quarries north of the city is thin and carries a sharp, metallic tang that makes the back of your throat itch. You are standing on a jagged ridge of the Zaria Plateau, watching Amina's scouts as they chip away at the earth with pickaxes made of the very iron they are seeking to refine. This is the search for the copper sands, the specific mineral deposits required to create an alloy strong enough to withstand the violent expansion of burning gunpowder. You're probably feeling the burn in your calves from the climb, and honestly, without a modern hiking boot, these slippery schist slopes are a recipe for a twisted ankle. But Amina moves across the rocks with the practiced balance of someone who has spent her life surveying the bones of her kingdom. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Hausa region sat atop some of the richest mineral veins in West Africa. With ancient mining techniques involving deep shaft extraction and sophisticated ores, Amina isn't just looking for quantity, she's looking for the right chemistry. She picks up a handful of earth that shimmered with a dull greenish humalakite and azurite. She knows that pure iron is often too brittle for a cannon. It shatters under pressure. To create a chamber that can hold a miniature sun, she needs a specific blend of copper, tin, and perhaps a touch of local zinc to create a resilient bronze or a soft iron that expands without exploding. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that claims Amina's mineralogists would test the quality of the copper sands by tasting the water that ran off the rocks during the rainy season. A certain bitterness indicated a high concentration of the minerals needed for the foundry. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but in a world without lab equipment, the human senses were the only spectrometers available. You watch as she holds a stone up to the light, her eyes searching for the specific crystalline structure that promised durability. She's looking for the hidden ingredients that the northern traders usually kept for themselves. Historians still argue whether Amina's engineers possessed the knowledge to create hooped cannons barrels reinforced with external iron bands or if they relied entirely on the thickness of the cast. Some suggest that the copper sands were part of a secret trade agreement with the Akan people to the south, who traded high-grade copper for the protection of Zazzau's cavalry. You see a group of laborers hauling heavy wicker baskets filled with the green flecked or down the mountainside. This is the hidden labor of the empire, the thousands of anonymous hands that provided the raw materials for the queen's ambition. You follow her into a small, shaded ravine where a makeshift furnace has been set up for assaying the day's find. This is the scientific heart of the operation. Amina watches as a small amount of the ore is melted down and poured into a tiny, thick-walled test cylinder. Once it cools, she orders a soldier to strike it with a heavy sledgehammer. If it cracks, the ore is rejected. If it merely dents, she nods. You are seeing the 16th century version of a high-pressure stress test. The secret of the cannons wasn't just the gunpowder, it was the metallurgy of the vessel that contained it. The quarry is a place of constant noise, the rhythmic clink-clink of the picks, the shouting of the overseers, and the occasional roar of a localized landslide. Amina seems to thrive in this chaos. She is calculating the yield of the earth. She knows exactly how many baskets of sand are needed for a single barrel. She is also aware of the ecological cost. The hillsides are being stripped of timber to fuel the assaying fires. To build the future, she is literally consuming the landscape of the past. You see a village elder watching from a distance, his face a mask of concern. He sees the copper sands as the blood of the earth. Amina sees them as the armor of the state. You notice a particular vein of reddish clay near the copper deposits. Amina stops to examine it. This is the refractory clay needed to line the molds. It can withstand the heat of molten metal without crumbling. She realizes that the copper sands are useless without the fire clay. It's a lesson in interconnectedness. Make one revolutionary weapon. You need a dozen different types of earth to work in perfect harmony. She begins to mark out the boundaries of the quarry with red-painted stones. This land is now royal domain, protected by the queen's spears and the threat of her growing legend. As the sun begins to dip, casting long purple shadows across the excavated pits, the quarry takes on a haunting industrial beauty. The copper sands glow in the fading light like spilled jewels. Amina stands at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the line of workers snaking back toward the city. She isn't just seeing laborers, she's seeing the supply chain of a superpower. She turns to you, her face smudged with the dust of the mines. And for the first time, you see the exhaustion behind the focus. This hidden work is grueling, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. Before you descend back to the plains, Amina takes a small vial of the refined copper dust and tucks it into her belt. It's a trophy, but also a promise. The secrets of the earth have been yielded to her. The foundries in the city are waiting, and the masters of fire have the heat ready. All they need is the copper sands to give the fire a shape. You realize that the transformation of the Hausa states isn't just happening in the palaces or the market it's happening here, in the dirt and the grit. One basket of sand at a time. The thunder is getting closer, and its ingredients are finally being gathered. The transition from a city of commerce to a city of industry is complete the moment you step back through the gates of Zaria. The central plazas, once filled with the colorful displays of cloth merchants and the rhythmic haggling over kola nuts, have been requisitioned. You are standing in the middle of a literal market of war. The stalls that once sold delicate pottery now house piles of heavy iron shot, and the dyer's quarters, famous for their deep indigo vats, have been partitioned to handle the volatile chemicals needed for large-scale production. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's mobilization was total. She didn't just build an army, she transformed the very urban fabric of her capital to support a sustained military-industrial complex. You can see the confusion on the faces of the foreign traders they came to by silk. But they are finding a city that is casting its future in bronze. You follow Amina through the newly established foundries that sit right in the shadow of the palace walls. The scale of the operation is staggering for the 16th century. You're likely dodging sparks and trying not to trip over the long cooling molds that line the walkways. There's a quirky, fringed tidbit that the city's perfume sellers were moved to the outskirts because the smell of the foundries' mix of sulfur, coal smoke, and hot metal was offending the ancestors. In reality, it was likely because the chemical runoff from the saltpeter refinement would have ruined their delicate floral oils. You see the hidden cost of progress everywhere. The soot-stained walls that were once pristine red clay, and the relentless noise that has replaced the melodic calls of the fruit sellers. Amina looks at the smoke not as pollution, but as the breath of a rising giant. She sees the efficiency of having the market stalls right next to the assembly lines. The shells come in at one end of the square as taxes, and the cannons go out the other as power. Historians still argue whether Amina's transformation of the marketplace was a temporary wartime measure or a permanent shift in Hausa urban planning. Some suggest that the Ganywar Amina were designed specifically to create industrial corridors that kept the heat and noise of the foundries away from the residential quarters while keeping them accessible to the trade routes. You watch as a massive bronze tube, still warm to the touch, is hoisted onto a heavy wooden sled. This is no longer a prototype, it is a standardized weapon of the Zazzau state. The market of war has achieved something incredible. It has taken a decentralized craft and turned it into a factory system. You notice that the taxmen have now become quality control officers. They aren't just counting shells anymore. They are measuring the bore of the cannons with standardized wooden rods. Amina understands that for a military to be effective, its equipment must be consistent. If every cannon requires a different size of shot, the logistics of a campaign will collapse. She is introducing the concept of interchangeable parts to the savannah. You see her reject a barrel that is slightly too thin at the breech, her voice sharp and uncompromising. The smith bows his head, knowing that in this new economy, waste is a crime against the crown. The marketplace is also where the secret of the gunpowder is being scaled up. You see the saltpeter bed's massive pits filled with organic waste and earth being managed by a specialized guild. It's a dirty, smelly business, but it's the only way to ensure a steady supply of propellant. Amina walks past the pits without holding her nose. She understands that the thunder requires the rot of the earth to function. She is the first ruler of the region to realize that a kingdom's power is directly tied to its chemical output. The market stalls that once held spices are now filled with sacks of charcoal, sulfur, and the white gold of the nitrate beds. As the evening sun hits the foundries, the glow of the molten metal competes with the sunset. The city feels heavy, metallic, and purposeful. You see the merchants who have stayed, the ones who realized that there is more money to be made in supplying the queen's foundries than in selling luxury silks. They are the new elite, the industrial merchants of Zazzau. They provide the lead for the shot and the timber for the carriages. Amina has successfully co-opted the capitalist spirit of the Hausa people and harnessed it to the chariot of her ambition. Before the night shift begins, Amina stands on a raised platform in the center of the market. she doesn't give a speech, she simply watches, as the last of the day's castings are moved toward the barracks. The sound of the market, the clanging, the roaring of the bellows, the rhythmic chanting of the workers is the soundtrack of her reign. You realize that the hidden story of the Hausa Queen isn't just about the battles she won. It's about the economy she built to win them. The market taxes didn't just buy cannons, they became the cannons. You follow her back toward the palace, leaving the market of war behind, but the heat of the foundries stays with you. The city of Zaria has been forged into something new, a fortress that is also a factory, a place where the wealth of the world is being converted into the iron will of a single woman. The training of the gunners is next, and as the first test fires echo from the practice range outside the walls, you realize that the transformation of the marketplace was just the beginning. The thunder now has a home, and the world is about to hear it. The transition from a city of industry to a camp of discipline happens just beyond the Queen Amina, in the wide, sun-scorched expanse of the training fields. You are standing in the dust as the first gunners of the savannah prepare for their morning drills. The air here doesn't smell of the market's spices. It smells of acrid smoke and the sour sweat of men pushed to their absolute limits. You see the traditional cavalry, the pride of the Hausa states, looking on from the sidelines with a mixture of awe and deep-seated suspicion. These are the men who have spent their lives mastering the lance and the horse. And now they are watching a new class of soldier handle a bronze tube that looks more like a ritual object than a weapon. You're probably squinting against the glare, and if you value your hearing, you'd be wise to cover your ears. There are no modern noise-canceling headphones in the 16th century, and the thunder is unforgiving. Amina is on horseback, her posture as rigid as the iron shot being stacked nearby. She isn't just a queen today, she is the drill sergeant of a revolution. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's army was the first in the region to integrate a specialized corps of infantry and artillerymen alongside the heavy cavalry, a tactical shift that required a complete overhaul of traditional West African warfare. You watch as she rides between the ranks, her eyes scanning the way the men hold their linstocks, the long poles used to ignite the touch holes. This is the grueling process of unlearning. These men were raised to value individual glory and the physical prowess of the charge. Now they must learn the cold, mechanical patience of the gunner. There's a quirky fringe tidbit in the oral records of the Zaria barracks that Amina's first recruits for the cannon crews were unsoldiers at all, but the most disciplined members of the blacksmith's guild. The logic was that the men who built the weapons wouldn't be afraid of the heat and noise they produced. Imagine being a career soldier, a master of the sword, only to be told you're being replaced by a guy who used to make your hose because he understands the metallurgy of the blast. You see the tension in the camp. Amina handles it with a characteristically sharp wit, once telling a grumbling cavalry captain that a horse can run fast, but it cannot outrun the sound of its own fear. Historians still argue whether these early gunners used tapered loading techniques or if they were still struggling with the fundamental physics of recoil. Some scholars suggest that Amina's trainers developed a unique tripod system made of local shabuta wood to stabilize the barrels in the soft savanna soil. You watch as a team of 4 men struggles to position a medium-sized thunderstick. It's a nightmare of logistics. They have to measure the powder by the handful, a terrifyingly imprecise science and ram the shot home with heavy wooden poles. If they pack it too loose, the shot dribbles out. Too tight, and the barrel becomes a grenade. You see a young gunner's hands shaking as he approaches the breech with a glowing match. Amina doesn't yell, she simply watches, her presence a silent command for him to master his own nerves. The training is a symphony of repetitive motions. Clean the bore, measure the powder, ram the shot, aim the tube. Repeat until the sun is at its zenith and the barrels are too hot to touch. Amina is introducing fire discipline, a concept that would eventually change the face of global combat. In a world where battles were often decided by a single heroic charge, she's building a machine made of men and metal that functions on timing and teamwork. You notice that she has assigned a scribe of the blast to each crewman who records how far the shot traveled and how much powder was used. She is literally conducting the first ballistic experiments of the Sahel. You see the psychological toll this takes on the men. The noise of a 16th century cannon discharge is a physical blow to the chest. It feels like the air is being sucked out of your lungs. The horses in the distance are rearing and whinnying, terrified by a sound that doesn't exist in nature. Amina rides her own stallion right up to the firing line, forcing the animal to grow accustomed to the roar. She is leading by example, showing her men that the thunder can be tamed. If you were standing there, you'd likely be shaking just as much as the recruits. The "you probably wouldn't survive" reality here is that early gunpowder was incredibly unstable. A single spark in the wrong place could send the entire training camp to the ancestors in a heartbeat. As the afternoon wears on, the first successful battery fire is attempted. Instead of one gun firing at will, 3 guns are fired in a coordinated volley. The result is a rolling crash that echoes off the city walls and sends birds screaming from the trees for miles. Amina's eyes light up. This is what she has been building toward. She sees the path forward, not just single weapons, but a concentrated wall of fire that no shield wall can withstand. She turns to the Matawaki, who is looking at the smoking barrels with a pale face. She doesn't need to say anything. The look on his face is enough. He realizes that the age of the lone hero is ending, and the age of the engineer has begun. Before the men are dismissed to their barracks for a meal of millet porridge and dried fish, Amina walks the line. She stops to inspect the burn scars on the gunner's arms medals of a new kind of service. She tells them that they are the voice of Zazzau. It's a clever bit of branding that turns a terrifying job into a prestigious one. You follow her back toward the gate as the sun sets, the dust of the training field settling over everything like a gray shroud. The men are exhausted, their ears are ringing, and their faces are blackened with soot, but they walk with a new kind of stride. You realize that Amina hasn't just trained soldiers, she has created a new social class. These gunners owe their status entirely to her and her technology, not to the old clan hierarchies. She has built a military that is personally loyal to her vision. As you enter the city, the thunder has finally stopped for the day. But the silence feels different now. It's the silence of a predator that has just finished sharpening its claws. Tomorrow, the first test at the city walls will determine if all this training and all those market taxes were worth the risk. The Queen is ready to speak to the world, and she's going to use the language of fire. The morning air is brittle and still, as if the world itself is holding its breath in anticipation of what's to come. You are standing on the southern ramparts of Zaria, the red mud of the battlements feeling cool under your palms. Below you, the ground has been cleared of brush and livestock for a half-mile radius. In the center of this kill zone stands a mock fortification, a thick wall of sundried bricks and timber designed to mimic the defenses of the rival Quara Rafa. This is the first true test of the Queen's thundersticks. If they fail, Amina's reputation as a visionary leader will shatter alongside the brittle bronze of the barrels. If they succeed, the geopolitical map of the Hausa states will be redrawn before the sun hits its zenith. You can feel the nervous energy of the crowd that has gathered on the walls. Even the skeptics have gone silent. Amina stands next to the lead gunner, her hand resting lightly on the breech of the largest cannon. A piece the Smiths have nicknamed the Lion of Zazzau. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's military innovations were often tested in public displays of power, designed as much to intimidate her own rebellious subjects as to warn her enemies. You watch as the crew goes through the motions you saw in the training fields, but their movements are slower now, deliberate and heavy with the weight of the moment. They are using a vent prick to clear the touch hole, a small but vital step that ensures the spark reaches the main charge. You're likely gripping the edge of the wall, your knuckles white. One rogue spark or a hairline fracture in that metal, and everyone on this platform is headed for an early meeting with their ancestors. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit that says Amina insisted on the first shot being aimed by a blindfolded mastersmith to prove that the weapon's power came from its construction, not the evil eye of the operator. It's a bit of 16th century theater, a way to demystify the technology while making it seem even more supernatural. You see the scribe of the blast checking his water clock, ensuring the powder hasn't sat too long in the humid morning air. Amina takes a slow, deep breath, her eyes never leaving the target. She isn't just looking at a wall, she's looking at the obstacle of tradition. This shot is the final answer to the elders in Section 5 who mocked her secret project. Historians still argue whether Amina used stone-shot, carefully carved spheres of granite or if she had already transitioned to the more devastating Castoran balls. Some scholars believe she utilized canister rounds bags of scrap metal and river stones for this demonstration, to show how the weapon could clear a breach of infantry. You watch as the gunner brings the glowing linstock toward the breach. The silence is so absolute, you can hear the sizzle of the match. Then the world disappears in a wall of white smoke, and a sound so violent it feels like a physical punch to your stomach. You probably stumbled back, your ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowns out the screams of the startled horses below. As the smoke begins to clear, drifting lazily over the savannah like a ghost, a collective gasp rises from the walls. The mock fortification hasn't just been hit, it has been deleted. Where there was a solid wall of brick and timber, there is now a jagged smoking crater. Splinters of wood are scattered like toothpicks across the red dirt. It's a mainstream historical fact that traditional African fortifications were designed to resist arrows and infantry rushes, not the kinetic energy of a 10-pound ball traveling at hundreds of feet per second. Amina doesn't cheer. She simply nods to the master smith, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. The "you probably wouldn't survive" reality check here is the shockwave. If you were standing too close to the front of that barrel, the pressure alone could have collapsed your lungs. The psychological impact on the witnesses is immediate. You see the Matawaki and his cavalry officers looking at the wreckage with expressions of pure terror. They realize that the walls they spent their lives defending are now as fragile as eggshells. Amina turns to the foreign dignitaries, the men from Songhai and the northern caliphates, and asks if they would like to inspect the target. It's a power move of the highest order. She isn't just showing them a weapon, she's showing them the end of their era. You follow her down from the ramparts, the smell of burnt sulfur clinging to her robes like a perfume of conquest. You notice the masters of fire are already swarming the gun, checking the barrel for heat cracks or bulging. This is the scientific follow-up to the spectacle. They are measuring the recoil distance, noting how the wooden carriage held up against the violent kick of the blast. Amina stops to talk to the young apprentice who suggested the sand tempering for the molds. She places a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of validation that is worth more than 1,000 shells. She knows that today was just the proof of concept. The real challenge will be repeating this performance in the mud of a rainy season or under the pressure of enemy fire. As the sun climbs higher, the city begins to celebrate, but the atmosphere has changed. The thunder is no longer a rumor or a secret project. It is a reality that Zaria must now live with. You see the shell runners already heading back to the treasury to pull more funds for the next batch of castings. The market of war is about to go into overtime. Amina walks through the gates of the city, and for the first time, the people don't just cheer for their queen, they move back with a sense of profound, holy dread. She has brought the power of the heavens down to the red clay of Zazzau. Before the day ends, Amina returns to the wreckage of the mock wall. She picks up a piece of the shattered timber, turning it over in her hand. She tells you that the wall is only a shield for the weak. For the strong, it is a target. She is already thinking about the next step logistics. A cannon is useless if it stays in Zaria. She needs to move these bronze monsters across hundreds of miles of unmapped territory. You realize that the success of the test has created a whole new set of problems. As you walk back to the palace, under a sky that is still hazy with gunpowder smoke, you know the quiet life is over. The thunder has spoken, and now the queen must lead it on a march that will not stop until the borders of the world have been pushed back. The transition from the stable, sun-baked ramparts of Zaria to the unpredictable sludge of the southern frontier is a brutal awakening. You are standing in the middle of a logistics nightmare, watching a train of 6 massive oxen struggle to pull a single thunderstick across a landscape that seems determined to swallow it whole. The rainy season has arrived with a vengeance, turning the fine red dust of the savannah into a thick, clingy paste that acts like quicksand for anything weighing more than a few hundred pounds. You're likely soaked to the bone, your boots weighing an extra 5 pounds each from the mud, and if you thought the sound of the cannon was violent, it's nothing compared to the symphony of cracks, groans, and human shouting as a wooden wheel shatters under the weight of a bronze barrel. Amina is not riding in a litter or staying dry under a canopy. She is on the ground, her indigo robes hiked up and stained with the very earth she is trying to conquer. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's campaigns were legendary for their pace and distance, often covering territories that modern travelers find daunting even with four-wheel drive. You see her directing a team of Pathfinder's pioneers, equipped with heavy iron axes and machetes. They aren't just clearing a trail, they are literally engineering a road as they go. This is the logistics of the heavy march. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer physical exhaustion of this. The humidity alone makes every breath feel like you're inhaling warm soup, and the threat of malaria-carrying mosquitoes is a constant, buzzing reality check. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit often found in the accounts of old Zaria families that Amina's engineers developed a system of moving bridges made of hollowed-out baobab trunks that could be laid down across seasonal streams and then picked up and carried by the following infantry. It was a 16th-century version of a portable pontoon, and without it, the Thunder would have been relegated to a stationary museum piece. You watch as a crew of 20 men uses thick ropes made of braided palm fiber to heave a cannon up a slippery incline. Amina is there, her hand on the rope alongside them, her presence turning a miserable task into a shared mission. She knows that if the guns don't reach the Quarafa borders, her entire strategy collapses. Historians still argue whether Amina utilized primitive ball bearings made of polished hardwood soaked in shea butter to reduce friction on the axles of her gun carriages. Some scholars suggest that the sheer weight of the cannons forced her to develop the first all-weather roads in the region, which would later become the backbone of the Hausa trade network for centuries. You see the scribe of the march frantically trying to keep his scrolls dry while recording the loss of 3 donkeys to a sudden flash flood. Amina doesn't pause to mourn the animals. She is focused on the tonnage. She calculates how many bags of grain are needed to keep the oxen moving and how much charcoal must be carried to keep the gunners' matches dry. You notice a group of local villagers watching from the tree line, their eyes wide with disbelief. They have seen armies before cavalry raids and infantry skirmishes, but they have never seen a force that carries the earth's thunder on its back. Amina stops to speak with their headman, but she doesn't ask for tribute, she asks for labor. She offers the village a share of the coming spoils if they provide 50 men to help clear the road for the next 10 miles. It's a masterclass in force multiplication through local cooperation. She is building her road and her empire at the same time, turning every village along the route into a logistical node. The heavy march is also a test of the weapons themselves. You see the smiths constantly checking the bronze for sweating, the condensation that can lead to corrosion or, worse, damp powder. They are using specialized leather covers, stitched tight and sealed with animal fat to protect the muzzles and the breeches. Amina oversees the powder guards, a specialized unit whose only job is to ensure the saltpeter and sulfur stay as dry as a desert bone. If the powder clumps, the thunder becomes a muffled pop. You realize that the technology is only as good as the box it's carried in. As the sun begins to set through a break in the heavy gray clouds, the camp is established with a military precision that borders on the obsessive. The cannons are placed in the center of a defensive ring, their muzzles pointing outward even in sleep. You sit by a smoky fire, trying to dry your clothes, while Amina reviews the scouts' reports. They are only 2 days away from the Quarafa outpost at the river crossing. The march has been a nightmare of mud, broken wheels, and sweat, but the thunder is still here. It has survived the savannah's attempt to drown it. Before you drift into a fitful sleep, you see Amina inspecting the feet of the oxen. She cares for these animals like they are her own cavalry horses, knowing that her entire reign depends on their strength. She tells you that the distance is the enemy we fight before we ever see a spear. You realize that the hidden part of her story isn't just the cannons, but the sheer grinding willpower it took to move them across a continent that didn't want them moved. The road behind you is a scar on the land, a permanent record of her passing. The road ahead is the unknown, but as the first stars peek through the clouds, you know that the Queen and her heavy bronze monsters are ready for the confrontation they've traveled so far to find. The transition from the grinding, muddy march to the sudden, sharp reality of the front line happens at the banks of the Benue River. You are standing in a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the Quarafa. Stronghold, a sprawling complex of timber-reinforced earthworks that has defied the Hausa kings for generations. The air here is heavy with the scent of damp river grass and the metallic temps of the thundersticks being unlimbered. You can see the Quarafa warriors on their battlements, their feathered headdresses catching the morning light as they beat their rhythmic war drums. They look confident. They've seen Zazzau's cavalry before, and they know the river protects them. You probably feel a knot in your stomach, a cold dread that no amount of modern perspective can soothe. If you were spotted now, you wouldn't be facing a debate. You'd be facing a rain of poisoned arrows. Amina is not at the back of the formation. She is standing with the forward battery, her eyes fixed on the main gate of the fortress. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Quara were a formidable military power in the 16th century, often launching devastating raids into the heart of Hausa territory. But they have never seen a siege like this. You watch as the masters of fire and the gunners work in a synchronized, silent dance. They are arranging the guns, adjusting the wooden wedges under the carriages to change the angle of the barrels. Amina raises a hand, signaling for the first voice of Zazzau to speak. This is the moment where theory meets the blood of the savannah. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit in the oral histories of the Jukan people. The descendants of the Quara says the first time they heard the cannons, they believed the sky had cracked open and the ancestors were screaming in rage. Imagine being a defender who has spent years perfecting your wall, only to have a piece of it vanish in a cloud of sulfur and fire. You see the first shot strike the heavy timber gate. The sound is a physical hammer blow that rolls across the river, echoing off the distant hills. The gate doesn't just break, it disintegrates into a cloud of splinters and dust. Amina doesn't wait for the smoke to clear. She orders the second and third guns to fire in a rolling barrage. Historians still argue whether Amina utilized incendiary shot balls wrapped in pitch-soaked fire to set fire to the thatched roofs inside the fortress. Some scholars suggest that the psychological shock of the weapons was so absolute that the Quara defenders began to throw themselves into the river rather than face the iron demons. You watch through the haze as the fortress falls into total chaos. The drums have stopped, the confidence has vanished. Amina's cavalry, the Madawaki leading them, are positioned on the flanks, waiting for the moment the breach is wide enough. She is using the cannons not just to destroy, but to open the enemy like a surgeon. You notice a shift in Amina's expression. It isn't triumph, it's a clinical observation of effectiveness. She is watching how the earthworks absorb the impact. She sees that the loose soil of the Quara ramparts actually dampens the blow of the solid shot, forcing her to order the gunners to aim for the rigid timber supports instead. This is live tactical feedback. She is learning how to dismantle a civilization in real time. You realize that the you probably wouldn't survive reality of this siege isn't just the projectiles. It's the sheer, suffocating heat of the gunpowder smoke that settles in the valley, making it nearly impossible to breathe or see. The siege of the Quara is the first time the thunder is used in a sustained engagement. You follow Amina as she moves the battery closer, crossing the shallowest part of the river under the cover of the guns. This is a high-risk maneuver. If the guns get stuck in the riverbed, the Quara could rally and slaughter the crews. But the shock remains total. You see a Quara commander attempt to rally his men near the breach, but a single blast from a thunderstick loaded with riverstone canister shot clears the area in a heartbeat. The power dynamic of West Africa is shifting with every pull of the linstock. As the sun reaches its zenith, the fortress is no longer a stronghold. It is a smoking ruin. The Quara have retreated into the forest, leaving behind their stores of ivory and grain. Amina walks through the shattered gate, the mud of the riverbank still on her boots. She doesn't celebrate the death. She examines the damage to the walls. She is looking at the feedback loop of her engineering. She tells the smiths to note the durability of the barrels after 50 rounds. To her, this victory is just a data point in a much larger project. Before the camp is moved into the captured ruins, Amina stands on the highest point of the broken rampart. She looks south, toward the territories that have never paid tribute to a Hausa king. The thunder has worked. The secret project has proven its worth in the most brutal way possible. You realize that from this day forward, the hidden story of Zazzau will be one of expansion without precedent. The Quara were just the first to hear the voice of the queen, but they certainly won't be the last. As the smoke of the burning timbers mixes with the evening mist, you see the map of the world changing in Amina's eyes, one crater at a time. The transition from a conqueror of walls to a builder of them is perhaps the most enduring part of the Queen's mystery. You are standing in the center of a construction site that stretches as far as the eye can see. A massive scar of upturned earth that follows the new perimeter of the expanded Zazzau state. This is the birth of the Queen Amina, the walls of Amina. If you thought the logistics of the march were impressive, the engineering of these fortifications is a whole different level of obsession. You're likely covered in the fine orange dust of pulverized laterite, and your back probably aches just watching the thousands of laborers tamping down the mud. This isn't just a fence. It's a sophisticated military infrastructure designed to be both a shield for the people and a stable firing platform. For the very thunder that won the last battle, Amina is walking the line with a master mason, a man whose skin is as weathered as the stones he lays. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina is credited with the construction of hundreds of miles of defensive walls throughout northern Nigeria, many of which still stand as earthen ridges today. You watch as she inspects the slight inward slope of the wall that makes it nearly impossible for a siege ladder to gain a steady grip. But look closer at the design. You notice specialized indentations and wide flat-topped bastions at regular intervals. These aren't just for archers. They are gun emplacements, designed with the weight and recoil of her bronze cannons in mind. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer labor of this. The sun is a relentless hammer. And the you probably would unsurvive reality is that a single collapse of an uncured mud section could bury a dozen workers in seconds. There's a quirky fringe tidbit whispered among the local elders that Amina's walls were seasoned with a mixture of honey, cow blood, and a specific local resin to make the mud as hard as kiln-fired brick once it dried in the sun. Some even say she had the masters of fire bury small iron charms within the foundations to bind the earth to her will. You see her tapping a section of the finished wall with her staff, listening for the dull, solid thud that indicates a lack of air pockets. She is turning the entire kingdom into a fortress that can't just be bypassed. By building these walls around every conquered town, she isn't just providing security, she is claiming the land as a permanent part of Zazzau. Historians still argue whether Amina actually built all the walls attributed to her, or if Kasuwar Amina became a generic term for any fortification built during that era of unprecedented expansion. Some scholars suggest the walls served a dual purpose: military defense and economic enclosure, allowing the queen to funnel all trade through specific taxable gates. You watch as she directs the placement of a bastion gate, a double-aired entrance that forces any intruder into a narrow killing zone. This is architectural warfare. She is using the very earth of Africa to create a machine of control. You notice that the walls are wide enough on top for 2 horses to ride abreast a highway for her, messengers, and a rapid deployment track for her troops. The engineering of the Kasuwar also accounts for the thunder. You see the gunners practicing how to hoist the cannons onto these elevated platforms, using a system of pulleys and ramps. By placing the guns on the walls, Amina gives them a plunging fire advantage, allowing them to hit targets much further away than they could on level ground. She is effectively creating the first modern defensive perimeter in the Sahel. You follow her into a newly finished watchtower, where the view of the surrounding plains is breathtaking. From here, nothing moves without the queen's knowledge. The walls are her eyes, her teeth, and her legacy. You notice a group of merchants waiting at one of the completed gates. They aren't complaining about the wait, they are marveling at the security. Inside these walls, the market of war from Section 11 can function without fear of a midnight raid. Amina has realized that commerce follows the wall. The more she builds, the more the wealth of the region flows toward her center. You see her take a handful of the wall med and rub it between her fingers. She tells the mason that the wall must breathe with the rains but stand firm against the wind. She is as much a scientist of the soil as she is a leader of men. As the sun begins to set, the shadow of the wall stretches miles across the savannah, a long dark finger pointing toward the future. The Kasuwar Amina are more than just mud and stone. They are a psychological barrier. To her enemies, they represent an immovable force. To her subjects, they are the promise of a peaceful night's sleep. You sit atop the ramparts as the cool evening breeze kicks up, watching the laborers light small fires along the construction line. The scale of the work is truly staggering, a monument to a woman who refused to be contained by the borders she inherited. Before you leave the wall for the night, Amina stands at the highest point of the bastion, her silhouette sharp against the purple sky. She tells you that a kingdom without a wall is just a field waiting to be harvested. She isn't just building a defense, she is building an identity. The people within these walls are no longer just members of various clans. They are the people of the wall, the people of Amina. You realize that while the cannons won the battles, it is the mud and the labor of the Kasuwar that will win the peace. As you descend the stairs, the rhythmic sound of the tamping rods continues into the night, a heartbeat of earth. an ambition that will echo through the centuries, long after the thunder has faded. The transition from the roar of the siege to the hushed, calculating atmosphere of the diplomatic tent is a masterclass in the diplomacy of the smoke. You are standing in a grand temporary pavilion on the borders of the Nupe Kingdom, where the air is a confusing mix of expensive musk and the lingering, acrid scent of the queens. Artillery escort parked just 100 yards away. This is Amina's unique brand of negotiation. She doesn't come with just words. She comes with the physical evidence of what happens when words fail. You're likely sweating under the heavy fabric of the tent, and if you're smart, you're staying very still. The "you probably would unsurvive" reality here is that a single breach of protocol, an accidental insult, or a misplaced hand on a weapon could turn this summit into a bloodbath before the first cup of hibiscus tea is poured. Amina is seated on a low, ornate stool, facing the emissaries of the neighboring states who have seen the Ganyuor rising and heard the thunder from the river. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's expansion was on just a series of mindless raids. She established a federation of states that paid tribute in exchange for protection and entry into the Zazzau trade network. You watch as she speaks, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the sheer menace of the bronze barrels visible through the tent's opening. She isn't threatening them directly. She is talking about cooperation and mutual prosperity. But every time she pauses, the distant sound of a gunner cleaning a Barola metallic clinkling acts as a punctuation mark they can ignore. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding these diplomatic sessions. Is said that Amina would have her gunners fire a single blank charge, powder but no shot at the stroke of noon, every day during the negotiations. The sheer ear-splitting volume would rattle the tea sets and make the foreign dignitaries jump out of their skins, while Amina wouldn't even flinch, continuing her sentence as if the sky hadn't just exploded. This acoustic intimidation was the 16th century equivalent of a flyover by fighter jets. You see the Nupe ambassadors glancing nervously toward the horizon, wondering if the next sound will be a blank or a 10-pound granite ball headed for their capital. Historians still argue whether Amina's federation was a true alliance of equals or a proto-empire held together by the Pax Zazzau peace, maintained through the threat of superior technology. Some scholars suggest that she was actually very generous in her terms, offering lower trade tariffs and military aid against northern raiders in exchange for the defense levy shells you helped collect in Section 8. You watch as she unrolls a map, not a military one this time, but one showing the flow of goods. She is proposing a unified market, protected by her walls and enforced by her guns. She is selling them a future where they don't have to fear the Korarafa anymore, provided they accept her as the ultimate arbiter. You notice the subtle psychological games she plays. She serves the emissaries food from their own regions, prepared by Zazzau cooks, a silent way of saying, "I know your culture, I know your tastes, and I already have a presence in your lands." She is using the smoke of her reputation to cloud their judgment, making her seem more powerful and more omnipresent than she might actually be. You follow her gaze as she watches the youngest Nupe prince, who is staring at the cannons with a mixture of terror and longing. She sees the future in him, a generation that will grow up believing that Zazzau's power is as natural and inevitable as the sun. The diplomacy of the smoke is also about information. You see her interpreters, who are often her top spies, leaning in to catch the hushed whispers between the delegates. Amina is learning who among her neighbors is desperate for protection and who is secretly plotting with the Songhai to the west. She is playing a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, and her thundersticks are the queens on her board. You realize that while the cannons won the river, it is her tongue and her timing that are winning the region. She is turning potential enemies into paying clients. As the sun begins to set, the tension in the tent finally breaks. One by one, the emissaries step forward to touch the hilt of Amina's ceremonial sword. A sign of their submission to the Federation, they have chosen the peace of the smoke over the fire of the siege. Amina accepts their oaths with a graciousness that is almost more terrifying than her anger. She knows that their loyalty is bought with fear, but she plans to keep it with profit. She promises them that as long as they contribute to the iron levy, the thunder will be their shield, not their executioner. Before the emissaries depart under a moonlit sky, Amina walks them to the edge of the battery. She allows them to touch the cold bronze of the barrels. It's a final, tactile reminder of the reality they've just signed on to. You see them recoil from the metallic chill, their indigo robes fluttering in the night breeze. They leave as allies, but the way they look back at the Zazzau camp tells you they know they just handed the keys of the savannah to the queen. You follow Amina back into the quiet of her own quarters. She looks tired, the mask of the invincible sovereign slipping for a moment. She tells you that the loudest gun is the one you never have to fire. She has successfully expanded her empire without spending a single ounce of powder this week. You realize that the hidden story of her cannons isn't just about the destruction they caused, but the way she used the idea of them to reshape the political landscape of West Africa. The Federation is born, and as the thunder is limbered up for the journey home, you know that Zazzau is no longer just a state, it is the sun around which all other Hausa states must now orbit. The air in the royal warehouses of Zaria has shifted from the earthy scent of grain to a volatile, nose-stinging cocktail of chemicals and luxury. You are standing among stacks of silk that feel like water in your hands, positioned right next to heavy, coarse sacks that smell of a lightning strike. This is the heart of Amina's mature economy: spice, silk, and sulfur. As the Queen of the Federation, you are now managing a trade network that spans from the Mediterranean to the Bight of Benin, and the balance you have to strike is terrifying. You need the silk and spices to keep the elite of the conquered states happy and subservient. But you need the sulfur and saltpeter to ensure they stay that way. Probably rubbing your eyes. Sulfur dust has a way of finding every sensitive membrane, and if you were to drop a single torch in here, you probably wouldn't survive. Doesn't even begin to cover the localized supernova you'd trigger. Amina is inspecting a shipment of white gold-refined saltpeter brought in from the northern oases. It's a mainstream historical fact that as gunpowder technology spread, the demand for its three core ingredients created a new type of resource diplomacy across the Sahel. You watch as she balances a handful of peppercorns in one hand and a piece of raw sulfur in the other. She is literally weighing the cost of flavor against the cost of fire. She knows that to keep the cannons singing, she has to keep the caravans moving. And to keep the caravans moving, she has to offer the world something it can't get anywhere else. She has turned Zazzau into the primary exchange for the most addictive substances of the 16th century. It's caffeine from the kola nut, salt, and the means of modern destruction. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests Amina's scented guards were actually a specialized unit that carried bags of aromatic spices like cloves and cinnamon, specifically to mask the smell of the gunpowder they handled. It was a bit of psychological warfare. You smelled cinnamon on the wind. You knew the thunder was close behind. Imagine a modern army smelling like a pumpkin spice latte before it opens fire. You see her negotiating with a Tuareg middleman, a man whose face is completely veiled except for his piercing eyes. He wants more silk for his sulfur. Amina doesn't haggle over the price. She haggles over the purity. She has a smith drop a pinch of the sulfur into a brazier riff. It burns with a clear blue flame. She pays. If it sputters, she seizes the cargo as a fine for subpar materials. Historians still argue whether Amina attempted to create a monopoly of the spark by forbidding any of the federated states from importing sulfur without her direct seal. Some scholars believe this led to a flourishing black market, where sulfur runners would smuggle the yellow stones disguised as medicinal minerals or yellow dye. You watch as a scribe records the incoming inventory. Every pound of sulfur is tracked with more precision than the gold. Amina understands that gold is a luxury, but sulfur is a necessity of state. She is managing a strategic reserve centuries before the term was coined, ensuring that even if the trade routes are cut, Zazzau can keep firing for a year. You notice a shipment of dragon's blood resin from the east, used for both medicine and as a binder for early incendiary weapons. Amina is diversifying her chemical portfolio. She is looking for anything that burns hotter, faster, or louder. But she is also a woman of the court. You follow her as she moves to the silk section, where she selects a deep crimson bolt for the wife of a rebellious vassal. This is the soft side of the spice, silk, and sulfur triad. A gift of silk can prevent a war. A barrel of sulfur can end one. She uses both with the same cold, calculated efficiency. The warehouses are a microcosm of the empire. You see the labor of 10 different cultures being sorted and graded. The hidden reality is the sheer danger of this storage. You see the saltpeter men's specialized workers who live in the damp, dark corners of the city, managing the nitrate beds you saw earlier. They are the untouchables of this new society, stained by the ammonia and the rot. Yet they are the ones who provide the breath for the queen's cannons. Amina visits them, standing in the stench without a word of complaint. She knows that the silk on her back is held there by the saltpeter in their pits. As the afternoon sun filters through the high, narrow windows of the warehouse, the dust motes dance in the air, a mix of silk fibers and chemical grit. It's a beautiful, lethal atmosphere. Amina stops at a crate of nutmeg and mace, spices that have traveled thousands of miles. She tells you that the world is a kitchen, and I am the one who decides the seasoning. She isn't just a queen anymore. She is a global commodities broker. She has successfully linked the destiny of the Hausa plains to the trade winds of the Indian Ocean and the camel paths of the Sahara. Before the warehouse is locked for the night, Amina ensures the sulfur watch is doubled. She knows that her enemies don't need to defeat her army. They just need to burn her ingredients. You follow her out into the evening air, which feels incredibly fresh after the suffocating interior of the storehouse. The city is quiet, but you know that beneath that silence, the chemicals are waiting. The silk is being sewn into banners, the spices are being prepared for a royal feast, and the sulfur is being ground into the powder that will sustain the Pax Zazzau for another season. You realize that the hidden story of the Hausa Queen is one of incredible logistical balance. She isn't just a warrior, she's a manager of volatility. As you walk back to the palace, the sunset turns the red walls of Zaria, the color of the dragon's blood resin. The empire is rich, it is fragrant, and it is highly explosive. Amina has built a world where the finest silk is always backed by the sharpest sulfur. And as you watch the lanterns being lit along the wall, you know that this balance is the only thing keeping the thunder under her control. The air in the quiet, shaded courtyards of the palace elders is thick with the scent of old leather and the rhythmic, low-frequency chanting of the griots. You are standing in a space where history isn't written in books, but stored in the living memories of men who can trace a lineage back 10 generations without a single pause. This is where you find the hidden records of the oral historians, and it's where the story of Amina starts to get complicated. You're likely leaning in, trying to catch the nuances of the Hausa dialects, and if you weren't an invited guest of the Queen, you probably wouldn't survive the scrutiny of these gatekeepers of the past. To them, history is a weapon, and they are very careful about who they let sharpen it. Amina is sitting on a simple mat, listening to an old man recount the exploits of her predecessors. It's a mainstream historical fact that West African history was primarily preserved through sophisticated oral traditions, with professional prizes and historians, the griots, acting as the ultimate authority on what really happened. But as you listen, you notice something strange. When the griot mentions the great queen, he speaks of her bravery and her walls, but he becomes curiously vague when it comes to the thundersticks. He describes the smoke as the breath of spirits and the cannons as the iron limbs of ancestors. He is mythologizing the technology. Stripping away the metallurgy and the chemistry you witnessed in the earlier sections, there's a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests certain conservative griots intentionally omitted the technical details of Amina's cannons because they viewed gunpowder as un-Hausa or a foreign corruption of traditional warrior honor. In their eyes, a hero wins with a blade and a horse, not with a bronze tube that kills from a distance. You see Amina's jaw tighten as the old man skips over the engineering of the Benue River siege. She knows that by turning her science into magic, they are erasing her genius. Imagine being a revolutionary engineer today, only to have people tell your grandkids that your inventions were actually just blessings from a forest spirit. You'd be frustrated too. Historians still argue whether the lack of technical detail in the oral record was a deliberate act of patriarchal erasure, or a practical way to keep the secret of the spark from falling into the wrong ears. Some scholars believe that Amina herself may have encouraged the mythic version of her story to maintain a sense of supernatural dread among her enemies. You watch as she interrupts the griot, her voice low but firm. She asks him to describe the weight of the copper. The old man fumbles, repeating a poem about the weight of the queen's justice. She isn't looking for poetry, she's looking for a record. She realizes that the very people responsible for her immortality are also the ones editing her out of the technical history books. You notice a younger apprentice historian sitting in the back, his eyes darting between the queen and the elder. He is holding a small piece of charcoal, surreptitiously marking symbols on a piece of tanned hide. This is the hidden record, the unofficial account. Amina notices him too. and a look of understanding passes between them. She is beginning to realize that if she wants her true story told, the story of the taxes, the sulfur, and the casting, she cannot rely on the official channels of the court. She is witnessing the birth of a counter-narrative in real time. The court historians are also the keepers of the genealogical truth. They argue about whether a woman can truly hold the title of Sarkin king, or if she must always be the Magagia queen mother, princess. This is the scholarly debate that still rages today. You see the elders whispering about the natural order of the savannah. Amina represents a disruption so profound that they are trying to fit her back into a traditional box. They praise her for her maternal protection of the walls, completely ignoring the fact that she built those walls as offensive firing platforms. You realize that the hidden story isn't just about what happened, it's about how the story was managed after the smoke cleared. As the sun sets, casting long skeletal shadows of the baobab trees across the courtyard, the session ends. The griots pack away their instruments, their faces masks of traditionalist dignity. Amina remains on her mat for a long time after they leave. She tells you that the tongue is a sharper tool than the plow, for it can bury a truth deeper than any seed. She knows that her cannons might crumble to rust, and her walls might wash away in the rains. But if the historians decide she was just a magical myth, the how of her empire will be lost forever. Before you leave the courtyard, you see Amina call the younger apprentice forward. She hands him a small, heavy bronze coin-knot currency, but a test casting from the foundry. She doesn't say anything, but the message is clear. Remember the metal. You follow her back toward the industrial heart of the city. The sound of the bellows a welcome contrast to the flowery, evasive language of the elders. The hidden records are being written in the memories of the people. But the queen knows she is fighting a second war for her own legacy, and the historians are the most dangerous opponents she's ever faced. The air in the private strategy room of the Zazzau Palace is cool, but the atmosphere is electric, with a different kind of tension. You aren't looking at maps of territories tonight. You're re-looking at a tray of intercepted letters and a collection of gifts that never reached their intended recipients. This is the world of counterintelligence and court sabotage. To your modern eyes, it looks like a scene from a spy thriller. But the "you probably wouldn't survive" reality here is much more visceral. In the 16th century, a spy didn't just steal data, they poisoned your well, bribed your master smith, or whispered a curse that could dismantle the morale of an entire battalion. Amina is sitting across from her head of internal security, a woman who moves through the palace like a ghost, and they are discussing the shadow war being waged by the Songhai Empire. It's a mainstream historical fact that as Zazzau rose to prominence, it became the primary target for the older, established powers, who saw the thunder as a threat to the regional status quo. You watch as Amina examines a small, intricate lock that was found on the door of the main sulfur storehouse. It's a foreign design, likely from the north. Someone was trying to get in, not to steal the sulfur, but to contaminate it with moisture or sand. You realize that the secret of the cannons is a burden as much as a blessing. Amina has to spend as much energy protecting her foundries from spies as she does using them against her enemies. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that Amina's foodasters were actually trained in metallurgy and chemistry so they could detect the faint, metallic scent of sabotage in more than just the royal meals. They were essentially human sensors for the industrial secrets of the state. You see her toss a heavy gold ring onto the table. It was taken from a merchant who was caught trying to sketch the internal dimensions of a cannon bore. He wasn't a traitor. He was a Songhai engineer with a death wish. Amina doesn't show anger. She shows a chillingly efficient curiosity. She wants to know who hired him and how much they were willing to pay for her secrets. Historians still argue whether Amina's reign of terror against spies was as widespread as some oral traditions suggest, or if she used misinformation as a more subtle weapon. Some scholars believe she intentionally leaked fake gunpowder recipes, mixtures that would merely smoke, or better yet, explode in the face of the user to discourage her rivals from trying to replicate her technology. You watch as she dictates a letter to a neighboring ruler, her words full of praise and friendship, while her eyes remain fixed on the evidence of that ruler's betrayal. She is playing a double game, using the smoke of diplomacy to hide the fire of her counterintelligence. You notice the Masters of Fire have been placed under a form of gilded house arrest. They are given the finest food in the best quarters, but they are never allowed to leave the foundry district without a royal escort. Amina understands that the most valuable asset she has isn't the bronze, it's the knowledge inside their heads. If a master smith were to be kidnapped by a rival, the thunder would belong to the world, and Zazzau would lose its edge. You see the cost of innovation in the weary eyes of the smiths? They are the prisoners of their own genius. The sabotage isn't just external. You see the tension between the new guard gunners and the old guard nobility, who feel their influence slipping away. Amina has to root out the internal dissenters who might be tempted to sell a secret to regain their lost status. She uses a system of secret watchers commoners who are paid in salt and protection to report any unusual meetings in the noble quarters. You realize that the walls of Zaria aren't just for keeping enemies out, they are for keeping the secrets in. The city is a pressure cooker of suspicion and technological pride. As the night deepens, Amina orders the execution of the captured Songhai spy not out of cruelty, but as a necessary signal. She knows that in this era, mercy is often seen as weakness. But before he is taken away, she shows him a finished cannon, its muzzle gleaming in the torchlight. She tells him to tell your masters that the secret isn't in the tube, it's in the hand that holds the fire. It's a bit of psychological warfare designed to rattle the Songhai leadership. She wants them to believe that even if they stole the design, they could never replicate the spirit of Zazzau. Before you leave the room, Amina turns to you, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. She tells you that the greatest wall I ever built isn't made of mud. It's made of silence. She is the curator of a mystery, the guardian of a technological leap that changed the history of a continent. You follow her back toward the main palace, the sound of the guards' footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The Shadow War continues every day, a silent battle for the thunder that never makes it into the praise songs of the griots. You realize that the hidden story of the Hausa queen is one of incredible paranoia and precision. She couldn't afford a single leak, a single mistake. As you pass the locked doors of the Foundry district, you see the silhouettes of the sentries against the moonlit walls. The secrets are safe for tonight, but you know that as long as the thunder exists, there will be someone in the shadows trying to steal it. Amina's reign is at its peak, but the weight of the crown is heavier than it has ever been. The air at the summit of the Zaria Hills is thin, cool, and carries the scent of 100 different cultures merging into one. You are standing beside Amina at the absolute peak of the Zazzau Empire, and the view is nothing short of breathtaking. From this height, the red walls of the city look like a ruby set into the green and gold velvet of the savannah. You can see the dust clouds of a dozen different military wings returning from the horizons, their banners snapping in the wind. This isn't just a kingdom anymore. It is a continental power. It's a mainstream historical fact that at the height of her 34-year reign, Amina had expanded Zazzau's influence to the Atlantic-facing forests in the south and the edges of the Sahara in the north, making Zaria the most powerful of the Hausa states. You watch as a delegation from the far-off Newplands arrives, not with weapons, but with tribute, baskets of rare bird feathers, fine brasswork, and thousands of manillas to be melted down. Amina is at the height of her personal and political power. She has achieved the impossible. She has unified the fractured House of Bakwai into a functioning, if forced, economic and military engine. You're likely feeling a sense of vertigo just from the height, but from the sheer scale of what one woman has orchestrated. The you probably wouldn't survive reality here, is the political volatility. At the peak, everyone is looking for a way to pull you down. One slip in judgment, one failed harvest, or one thunderstick that misfires in public, and the vultures will descend. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that at the height of her reign, Amina refused to stay in any city that didn't have a wall she had personally designed. This led to a construction boom across West Africa that some archaeologists call the Amina Horizona, specific layer of 16th century mudwork that marks the extent of her reach. You see her looking at the horizon with a restless energy. She isn't satisfied. For Amina, the peak isn't a place to rest. It's a better vantage point to see the next target. She is a woman who has become synonymous with the land itself. Historians still argue whether Amina's empire was a centralized state or a loose collection of tribute-paying satellites that functioned independently until the Queen's thunder arrived at their gates. Some scholars suggest that she pioneered a form of indirect rule that the British would later study and cooped centuries later. You notice how the governors of the conquered provinces bow there is a genuine fear in their eyes, but also a grudging respect. Under Amina, the trade routes are safer than they have been in a century. the Pax Zazzau, is real, even if it was bought with the smoke of the foundry. You follow her down to the great plaza where a celebration is underway. The music of the long royal trumpets blares a sound that can be heard for miles. Amina moves through the crowd, and you see the new guard gunners standing at attention. They are the elite now, the Iron Lords of the Savannah. She has successfully created a meritocracy, where a common smith can rise higher than a lazy prince. This is the secret of her peak. She didn't just conquer territory, she conquered the social order. She turned a stagnant hierarchy into a dynamic industrial society. But you notice the cracks too. The peak is expensive. You see the scribes frantically trying to balance the books. The cost of maintaining hundreds of miles of walls and a standing army of gunners is starting to outpace even the massive tribute coming in. Amina sees the numbers, and for the first time, you see a shadow of worry in her eyes. To keep the empire at its peak, she has to keep expanding. It's the bicycle effective. The conquest stops, the economy falls over. She is trapped by her own success, forced to be a perpetual motion machine of war. As the sun begins to set, casting a golden glow over the vast empire, the thunder is fired in a ceremonial salute. The sound is different now, less like a threat and more like a heartbeat. The people have grown used to it. They no longer dive for cover. They cheer. Amina stands on the palace balcony, the wind whipping her indigo robes. She tells you that to stand on the peak is to realize how much of the world is still in the shade. She is already planning the final campaign, the one that will take her to the very edge of the known world. You realize that the hidden story of the peak is the loneliness of it. Amina has outlived her rivals, outhought her advisors, and outpaced her own history. She is a giant in a world of small men. As you watch the lanterns flicker to life across the city of Zaria, you see an empire that is beautiful, powerful, and incredibly fragile. It is held together by the will of a single woman and the fire of her bronze tubes. The peak has been reached, but as every climber knows, the descent is often more dangerous than the climb. Before the night claims the plains, Amina turns away from the view. She doesn't look back. She is already thinking about the copper sands and the sulfur stores. The peak is just a memory now. The future is in the march. You follow her back into the palace, the echoes of the kakaki fading into the night. The empire of Zazzau is at its zenith, but the queen knows that stars that burn this bright often have the shortest lives. The air in the queen's private garden is deceptively still, filled with the heavy, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine that Trizand fails to mask the metallic temps that seems to have permanently bonded to your skin. You are sitting across from a woman who has become a living monument. But as the torches flicker low, you see the price of innovation etched into the lines around her eyes. Amina isn't looking at maps tonight. She's looking at her own hands, which are scarred by the same fire sparks as the masters of the forge. This is the isolation of the revolutionary. You're likely feeling a strange sense of melancholy. The you probably wouldn't survive reality here isn't a spear or a cannon blast, but the crushing weight of a life where every conversation is a tactical maneuver and every friend is a subject. Amina's innovation has cost her the very world she sought to protect. It's a mainstream historical fact that her reign was one of perpetual campaigning, meaning she spent more time in the saddle than on the throne. You realize that while she turned market taxes into cannons, she also turned her life into a machine. She has no heirs of her own. Body historians still argue whether this was a strategic choice to prevent dynastic infighting, or a personal sacrifice for the crown. In the 16th century Sahel, a woman without children was often viewed with pity or suspicion. But Amina wears her solitude like a suit of armor. You see her pick up a small bronze prototype of a wheel lock, turning it over with a weary familiarity. She is the mother of an empire, but the only children she has are made of bronze and iron. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit that Amina eventually stopped sleeping in a bed, preferring the hard ground of a military tent, even when she was within the palace walls. She had become so accustomed to the price of innovation, the constant readiness. The logistical that luxury felt like a threat to her edge. You see her wince as she adjusts her position. 30 years of riding has taken a toll on her body that no amount of royal medicine can fix. She is a woman who has outrun her own era, and the friction of that speed has burned away her personal life. The scholarly debate often touches on the social cost of her technology. To maintain the thunder, Zazzau had to remain a war-footing state. The price was paid by the farmers whose sons were drafted into the gun crews, and the merchants whose profits were constantly siphoned into the iron levy. You watch as she reviews a list of casualties from a recent border skirmish. She doesn't see names, she sees functions lost. She has had to become as cold as the metal she casts just to keep the system from shattering. You realize that the hidden tragedy of the Hausa Queen is that to save her people from the Quarafa, she had to become a force that was just as demanding, just as relentless. You notice a group of young pages watching her from a distance with a mixture of worship and absolute terror. To them, she isn't a human being. She is the Iron Queen, a force of nature that eats fire and speaks in thunder. Amina sees their gaze and looks away. She tells you that the higher the wall, the deeper the shadow it casts on the one who stands behind it. She is trapped inside the very defenses she built. The innovation that gave Zazzau its peak also created a world where she can never truly be at rest. If the thunder stops, the empire she built on the bicycle effect of constant growth might just collapse inward. The price is also visible in the city itself. Zaria is no longer the breezy market town of Section 2. It is an industrial hive. The trees have been cut for charcoal, the water is tainted by the runoff of the saltpeter beds, and the silence of the savannah has been replaced by the rhythmic thumping of the forges. Amina has traded the beauty of the landscape for the security of the state. She asks you if the world you come from, the modern world, is any different. You don't have an answer that doesn't feel like a lie. She smiles, a thin, tired expression, and tells you that progress is a fire that consumes the very thing it cooks. As the first light of dawn begins to gray the sky, Amina stands up. Her joints crack, a sound like dry wood snapping. She prepares to put on her armor once more. The final campaign is looming, and she must lead it. You see her looking at the Lion of Zazzau cannon parked in the courtyard, its bronze skin catching the pre-dawn light. It is her greatest achievement and her heaviest burden. She has spent her life turning shells into cannons, and now the cannons have claimed her life in return. Before you follow her out toward the barracks, she stops at a small fountain. She doesn't drink, she just watches the water. She tells you that the metal doesn't care who pours it, but the fire remembers the one who fanned the flames. She is ready to face the end of her story, knowing that the price of innovation has been paid in full. You realize that the hidden story of Amina isn't a fairy tale of a warrior princess. It's a gritty industrial epic about the cost of power and the loneliness of the pioneer. The thunder is calling again, and as the drums begin to beat, you see the Queen of Zazzau find her strength one last time, even as the weight of the empire threatens to pull her down into the red dust. The air at the camp near Attagara is thick with a humidity that feels like a physical weight against your chest. You are standing in the final staging ground of a campaign that has pushed the borders of Zazzau further south than anyone thought possible. The thundersticks are lined up along the riverbank, their bronze barrels blackened by a season of constant use, looking more like weary veterans than the gleaming weapons of the earlier years. You're likely feeling the frantic energy of a military machine that has been running at redline for 3 decades. The you probably wouldn't survive reality here is the sheer exhaustion of the unending march. In this tropical heat, a simple scratch turns to infection in hours. And the queen herself is no longer the agile girl from the Zazzau plains. She is a silver-haired titan who moves with a deliberate, pained grace. Amina is staring across the water toward Attagara, her eyes fixed on the horizon with a focus that borders on the prophetic. It's a mainstream historical fact that Amina's final campaign took her to this region, and it is here that the historical record suddenly and violently fractures. You watch as she orders the gunners to prepare for a crossing, but the masters of fire are hesitant. The powder is damp from the river mists, and the heavy carriages are sinking into the delta mud. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that says Amina's final command wasn't a battle cry, but a request for a bowl of water from the river, which she used to wash the soot from her face before riding into the tall grass alone. Historians still argue whether Amina died in the heat of battle at Attagara, or if she simply disappeared into the landscape she had spent her life conquering. Some oral traditions suggest she was betrayed by a contingent of her own old guard nobility who feared she would never stop the war, while others claim she performed a ritual of earth binding, merging her spirit with the very walls of the city. You see her mount her horse, a stallion, as gray as the morning misstand gesture for the thunder to follow. But as the first cannon fires, The sound is muffled, a hollow thud that lacks the sharp imperial crack of the Zarya tests. The elements themselves seem to be reclaiming the technology. But you notice that the scribe of the march has stopped writing. He is looking at the queen with a mixture of grief and awe. He realizes that the story is reaching a page he doesn't know how to ink. Amina doesn't look back at the camp. She doesn't look back at the empire. She is riding toward a mystery that no cannon can blast through. You follow the sound of her horse's hooves until they are swallowed by the rhythmic thumping of the Korarafa drums in the distance. The mystery of the final campaign isn't about how she died, but about how she chose to exit the stage. She left behind a world that was louder, harder, and more interconnected than the one she found, and then she simply let the smoke of the final volley carry her away. The transition from the living, breathing chaos of the Atagar campaign to the clinical, often dismissive pages of later history is a journey through a different kind of fog. You are standing in a quiet colonial-era library, the air smelling of mothballs and deteriorating paper, a world away from the sulfur-tinged heat of the Zazzau foundries. As you flip through the Victorian-era journals of explorers and early anthropologists, you see the erasing of the Iron Queen in real time. To these writers, the idea of a 16th-century African queen who industrialized her military with specialized artillery was not just a historical anomaly. It was an impossibility. You're likely feeling a surge of frustration. The you probably wouldn't. Survive reality here being the suffocating arrogance of a historical narrative that prefers to turn a brilliant engineer into a primitive myth. It's a mainstream historical fact that as European colonial powers moved into northern Nigeria in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they systematically downplayed the complexity of pre-colonial African states to justify their civilizing mission. You watch as the thundersticks you saw being cast in Section 11 are reclassified by these historians as ornamental, or likely imported from the coast, stripping Amina of her metallurgical agency. They could unreconcile the woman who turned market taxes into cannons with their own narrow view of African femininity and leadership. You see the scholarly debate shifting. Instead of arguing over the ballistics of the Kasuwar Amina, they began to argue whether Amina even existed at all. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that certain colonial administrators were so baffled by the sophistication of the Amina walls that they theorized they must have been built by a lost tribe of Phoenicians or wandering Romans. It's a 19th century version of saying, aliens did it because you can. Handle the fact that the locals had better masonry and a more coherent defense strategy than you did. You see the hidden tragedy of her legacy. The more she succeeded in life, the more she was doubted in death. The patriarchal shifts within the Hausa states themselves also played a role, as the social order became more conservative over the centuries. The image of a woman leading a market of war became an uncomfortable memory that needed to be softened into a folk legend about a brave princess rather than a ruthless industrialist. Historians still argue today about the de-engineering of Amina's story. They point out that while her walls remained visible across the landscape, the technical knowledge of the gunpowder she pioneered was allowed to fade, replaced by the traditional cavalry culture that looked better in a parade. You see the Iron Queen being replaced by the mythic queen. The cannons, once the pride of Zazzau, were often melted down for other uses, or lost in the humid soil of the southern deltas, their bronze skins turning back into the copper sands from which they were born. You realize that history is not just what happened, it is what we choose to remember, and for a long time, the world chose to forget the queen who spoke in thunder. As you close the dusty book, the silence of the library feels heavy. Amina didn't just lose her life at Atagara, she lost her voice in the global record. But as you look at the maps again, those long ridges of the Kasuwar still trace the shape of her ambition across the Nigerian earth. They are the hidden records that no colonial pen could fully erase. You realize that the you probably would unsurvive reality of history is that it requires a witness who is willing to look past the ink and see the iron beneath. The Queen of Zazzau is still there, buried under layers of myth and mud, waiting for someone to recognize the soot on her hands as the mark of a revolutionary. The transition from the dusty archives of the past to the vibrating living energy of modern-day Zarya is a journey through a landscape where the thunder has finally found its echo. You are standing on a weathered section of the Kasuwar Amina, the red earth beneath your feet packed so hard by 500 years of rain and footsteps that it feels like stone. The air here is a mix of diesel fumes from passing trucks and the timeless scent of wood smoke drifting from the nearby compounds. you're likely feeling a sense of profound continuity. The you probably wouldn't survive reality of this final stop isn't a battlefield, but the sheer, quote, emotional weight of realizing that history is on something that happened at S, something that is still happening. Amina's legacy is no longer hidden in the smoke of the foundry. It is etched into the very identity of the people. It is a mainstream historical fact that Queen Amina of Zazzau remains a towering national icon in Nigeria, her name gracing everything from schools and statues to the ubiquitous Amina female hostels at universities. You watch as a group of children plays in the shadow of the wall, their laughter bouncing off the same mud brick ramparts that once housed the Queen's bronze cannons. They might not know the exact chemical composition of her saltpeter beds, but they know that a woman once turned this very dirt into a shield for her people. There's a quirky fringe tidbit that modern Nigerian engineers and metalworkers often visit the old sites of the Zazzau forges to offer a silent prayer or a token of respect before starting a difficult project. They see her not as a ghost, but as the patron saint of making things happen. You see the legacy beneath the mud everywhere you look. Historians still argue whether the Amina we celebrate today is a composite of several powerful women or a single extraordinary individual. But in the streets of Zaria, the debate feels academic. To the people here, she is the queen of the savannah, the one who proved that the wealth of the market is only as valuable as the strength of the arm that protects it. As you walk along the ridge of the wall, you notice how the Ganyawar has become part of the urban ecosystem. Homes are built against it. Gardens are planted in its sheltered dips. The thundersticks may have been reclaimed by the earth, but the spirit of the innovation, the idea that a community can engineer its own destiny, means the true hidden story. You realize that the cannons weren't just weapons, they were the first loud announcement that Zazzau would no longer be a victim of its geography. Amina turned the market taxes into cannons to ensure that the market would always belong to her people. The sun begins to set, casting a deep, fiery orange across the horizon, the same color as the molten copper in the foundries you visited at the start of our journey. You sit on the edge of the rampart, watching the lights of the city flicker on. The thunder is gone, replaced by the low hum of a modern metropolis, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rhythmic thumping of the hammers and the roar of the Lion of Zazzau speaking across the river. You have traveled through the smoke, the fire, and the silence to find the truth of the Hausa Queen. She wasn't hidden by history. She was simply waiting for a witness who could see the iron beneath the myth. The world is quiet now. The long march of the Zazzau army has finally reached its end, and the red dust of the savannah has settled over the paths we've walked together. You can feel the stillness of the room around you, the soft background hum of your fan. Acting as a gentle anchor to the present as the images of bronze, cannons and mud brick walls begin to fade into the softest edges of your mind. There is a profound peace in knowing that the thunder has spoken its piece, and the Queen is finally at rest, her legacy secured, not just in the earth of Nigeria, but in the very idea of courage and ingenuity that you carry with you now. As the night deepens, let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, replaced by the comforting warmth of a story well told and a journey completed. And as the shadows stretch long and cool across the world, feel yourself drifting toward a rest that is as deep and as enduring as the walls of Zaria themselves. The fires of the forge are out, the market gates are closed for the night, and the Iron Queen is watching over the horizon of your dreams, a silent guardian in a world that she helped shape, one shell and one spark at a time. Sleep now, knowing the thunder has passed, leaving only the quiet strength of the earth behind.